Gas hissed, a wet choking sound deep in the mantle's throat, fighting the damp that seeped up through the flagstones of the Thames police court to settle in Bracken's boots. He did not look up. To look up would be to acknowledge the grey smear of dawn pressing against the high, grime-caked windows, a light so weak it offered no warmth, only a clearer view of the dust motes dancing above the inkwell like ash from a fire that had burnt out years ago. Instead, Thomas Bracken focused on the linen in his hands. White, immaculate, a square of fabric that had no business remaining so pristine in a room where the air tasted of coal smoke and the sour metallic tang of old blood that no amount of scrubbing could ever truly lift from the woodwork. He folded it, once, twice. The creases bit into his thumb, sharp and precise, a geometric comfort against the chaos waiting in the ledger before him. April 4th. The date sat at the top of the page, written in a hand that refused to tremble despite the cold gnawing at his knuckles. He folded the handkerchief again. It was smaller now, a tight white brick vanishing into the palm of his left hand, hidden from sight, hidden from the record. A secret square of order in a world that had lately decided to unravel itself into swaddling clothes and river mud. The pen hovered. Black nib, silver holder, the weight of it familiar as a bone in his own arm. He needed to begin. The clerk's duty was not to judge, nor to weep, nor to imagine the small lungs filling with silt. The duty was to transcribe, to make the horror grammatical, to ensure that when the Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the file, the syntax would be flawless, the punctuation unassailable, the tragedy neatly filed under B for baby farming alongside theft and vagrancy. Right then, Mr. Bracken, he whispered to the empty room, the words clipping off short, brittle as dry twigs. Let us have the truth of it. But the truth was a slippery thing, prone to sliding off the page and pooling on the floor. He dipped the pen. The ink welled, dark and viscous, catching the flickering gaslight with a sheen that looked too much like oil on water. He touched the nib to the paper. The scratch of metal against fiber sounded loud, a dry ripping noise that echoed in the silence of the corridor outside where the constables shuffled their boots, waiting to bring in the woman who had smiled while she strangled them. Amelia Dyer. The name required no embellishment. It sat heavy in the room already, a presence more substantial than the chairs or the tables or the man himself. Bracken wrote the heading, Deposition of Inspector George Godley. The letters flowed, looped, connected. He did not think about the field in Caversham. He did not think about the spade breaking the earth or the smell that Godley would soon describe with that terrifying, clinical detachment of a man who had seen too many holes dug in too many gardens. He thought only of the slope of the G, the cross of the T. If he could make the handwriting perfect, perhaps the contents would lose their power to rot the mind from the inside out. Perhaps if the record was clean enough, God would not notice the filth it described. A draught swept under the door, carrying the scent of the river, thick and brackish, the smell of low tide exposing things best left buried. It curled around his ankles, cold and insistent. Bracken paused. His thumb rubbed the edge of the hidden handkerchief, the linen now so small it was merely a knot of tension in his flesh. He waited for the shiver to pass. It did not. The cold had moved past the skin, settling deep in the marrow. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the knowledge that in less than an hour he would be writing down the details of a child wrapped in yellow flannel. A child who would never cry again. A child whose name was already being forgotten by everyone except the mother who had paid £5 to make her shame disappear. £5. The figure floated in his head, unbidden, intrusive. He pushed it away. That was for later. That was for the letter from Reading that sat in his coat pocket, burning a hole through the wool, a letter from Sarah asking if the medicine could be increased, if the doctor might be persuaded to visit more often now that the cough had turned wet. He could not think of Sarah, not here, not while the ink was wet. To think of her was to invite a comparison that his soul was not strong enough to withstand, a mirror held up to show him that his own desperation, his own need to hide a burden, was of the same breed as the women who knocked on Dyer's door. He took a breath. The air tasted of sulfur. He exhaled slowly, watching the mist of his own life hang for a second in the gaslight before dissolving into the gloom. Begin, he commanded himself, the voice harder now, stripped of the weary slippage that plagued him in the privacy of his lodgings. The door handle turned. A rattle of metal, the grind of the latch. Bracken's hand froze, the pen poised like a dagger above the page. He did not look at the door. He kept his eyes on the blank space below the heading, the white expanse waiting to be filled with the names of the dead. The footsteps entering the room were heavy, deliberate, the boots of a man who carried the weight of the earth on his soles. Inspector Godley. He smelled of wet wool and turned soil, a pungent, organic stench that clashed violently with the sterile smell of ink and paper. "Morning, Mr. Bracken," Godley said, his voice rough, stripped of any pleasantries that might soften the blow of what he was about to dictate. "Cold one." "Indeed," Bracken replied, not looking up, his focus narrowing to the point where the nib touched the paper. "Are we ready?" Godley pulled out the chair opposite. The wood screamed against the floorboards, a sharp, protesting shriek that made Bracken's teeth ache. "Ready as I'll ever be, though I'd sooner be anywhere else than recounting it." The ground was soft, too soft, like digging into meat. Bracken's hand tightened on the pen. The knot of linen in his palm dug deeper, a sharp point of pain grounding him. "Proceed, Inspector, word for word." Godley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his hands clasped together, the knuckles white. He stared at the wall behind Bracken, seeing nothing of the court, seeing only the grave. "I arrived at the property at first light. The woman, Dyer, was in the kitchen, making tea. Can you believe that? Making tea while the box was in the garden." Bracken wrote, "The accused was observed in the kitchen preparing tea." The words looked so ordinary, so harmless. They did not scream. They did not smell of decay. They were just words, black marks on white paper, a lie of omission that constituted the highest form of truth the law could accept. "She didn't run," Godley continued, his voice dropping to a murmur as if speaking too loudly might wake something sleeping in the earth outside. "She just pointed. It was the one from reading," she said, "the Marmon child." The wrapping had slipped. Stated that the wrapping had slipped. Bracken's pen tapped the desk. Once, twice, a rhythmic click against the wood, matching the ticking of the clock on the far wall, a steady, indifferent beat that counted down the seconds of a life that had already ended. He wrote faster now, the script tightening, the loops becoming smaller, more constrained, as if trying to imprison the meaning within the curves of the letters. The yellow flannel, the cord, the position of the body. Each detail was a stone added to the cairn he was building, a monument to a little girl named Doris who would never grow up, never marry, never write letters to a sister in reading. The gas jet flared suddenly, a burst of blue at the base, hissing louder. Bracken flinched. A drop of ink fell from the nib. It landed on the margin, a perfect dark sphere that immediately began to spread, bleeding into the fibers of the paper, expanding like a bruise. He watched it, hypnotized. It grew, irregular and ugly, reaching for the text, threatening to swallow the words he had just written. He reached for the knife to scrape it away, to restore the whiteness, to fix the error. His hands stopped. The knife hovered an inch above the page. The blot looked like mud, thick river mud, the kind that clung to boots and refused to wash off, the kind that covered the banks where the tide went out and left its secrets exposed for the gulls to pick at. He stared at it, the black shape pulsing in the gaslight, alive in its own slow, creeping way. To scrape it would be to tear the paper. To tear the paper would be to ruin the deposition. And the deposition had to be perfect. It had to be flawless. "Mr. Bracken," Godley's voice cut through the haze, "did you get that last part about the cord?" Bracken looked up. His eyes were wide, the watery blue stripped of any pretense of detachment, raw and exposed. He looked at the inspector, then down at the spreading stain, then back to the man who had dug the grave. "I have it," Bracken said, his voice sounding distant, as if spoken by someone else standing at the far end of the room. "Every word." He set the knife down. He left the blot. It sat there on the margin, a dark, accusing eye staring back at him, a permanent mark on the perfect record he had sworn to keep. He dipped the pen again, the ink welling up, dark and endless, and prepared to write the next line, knowing that no amount of scraping would ever make the page clean again. The river was already inside the room. It was rising, and he was drowning in the paperwork of it. The door opened. A court officer stepped inside, shaking a wet umbrella over the matting before hoisting a leather sack onto the corner of the desk. The thud displaced the inkwell. Bracken did not flinch, though the ripple in the black liquid mirrored the tremor in his own hands. "Post, Mr. Bracken," the officer said, wiping his nose on a sleeve stained with coal dust. "Morning bag from reading came through the sorting office early. Thought you'd want it." "Leave it." The officer dropped the sack and retreated, pulling the door shut with a click that sounded final, like a lock engaging on a cell. Godley shifted in his chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and reached for the matchbox on the table. He struck a light, the sulfur flare brief and sharp, illuminating the deep lines carved around his mouth. "Family?" Godley asked, blowing out the match. "My sister." Bracken reached into the sack. His fingers brushed against rough manila envelopes, official stamps, demands for payment, before finding the one piece of cream-laid paper that felt different, lighter, as though it carried less weight than the others. "She is unwell." He tore the envelope. The sound was too loud in the small room, a rip that exposed the interior. He pulled out the sheet. The handwriting sprawled across the page, the loops of her Y's and G's dragging downwards, shaky where the pressure of the pen had failed her grip. She wrote of the damp in the lodging house, of the cough that kept her awake until the gas lamps were lit on the street below, and of the chemist who refused to extend credit without a guarantee from London. "Thank you for the money, Tom," she had written in the margin, the ink faint. "The £10 saved me. I can breathe again." Bracken stopped. The air in the room grew thick, pressing against his eardrums. He looked down at the evidence pile stacked to his left, the documents seized from Amelia Dyer's cottage at 45 Kensington Road. The top sheet was a receipt book, bound in cheap cloth, the pages filled with Dyer's neat, commercial script. He had transcribed the entry only yesterday. "Received of Mrs. Fry the sum of £10 for the adoption of Doris." £10. The coins he had counted out on his own kitchen table, sovereigns gleaming yellow under the lamp, were the same weight as the coins Mrs. Fry had handed over. The same metal, the same crown stamped on the face. One parcel had travelled by post to Reading to buy medicine for a sister who might yet live. The other had travelled by hand to Kensington to buy a death warrant for a child who never stood a chance. He traced the number 10 on Sarah's letter. The paper felt greasy under his thumb. "Mr. Bracken," Godley leaned forward, the shadow of his brow deepening. "You've gone pale." "It is nothing," Bracken said, folding the letter until the crease grew sharp enough to cut into his finger. "A matter of accounts." "Looks like you've seen a ghost." "Worse." Bracken placed the letter flat on the desk, next to the deposition with the spreading ink blot. "I see the transaction." He pushed the paper away. It slid across the wood, stopping inches from the edge, hovering over the drop to the floor. The equivalent sat in his gut, a cold stone digesting slowly. He had judged the women who wrote to Dyer when he first saw the letters in the evidence bag, thinking them foolish, reckless, unwilling to face the shame of their bastards. Now he understood the arithmetic of desperation. When the coughing starts in the night, when the rent is due and the cupboard is bare, any hand offering gold looks like salvation. There was no moral distance between his own pocket and Dyer's till. They were lined with the same currency. Godley stood up, stretching his back until the vertebrae clicked. "We're done here, then. The deposition is signed." "It is complete." Bracken dipped the pen again, the nib hovering over the signature line. He did not sign. He held the pen there, the ink gathering at the tip, swelling, ready to fall. "Inspector, did Mrs. Fry identify the body herself?" "No." Godley pulled on his gloves, the leather creaking as he worked them tight. "She couldn't bring herself to do it, though she did identify the clothing, the flannel and the cord." "And the money? What about it? Did she say where she got it?" Godley paused, one hand on the door latch. He looked at Bracken, really looked at him, for the first time that morning. Sold her wedding ring, said it was the only thing left of value. Why? Bracken lowered the pen. The drop of ink fell, joining the previous blot, merging into a single, dark continent on the page. No reason, procedural only. "Right." Godley opened the door. The noise of the court corridor rushed in, a cacophony of shouting barristers, clattering boots, the distant bang of a cell door. "Don't stay too long with the dead, Thomas. They don't answer back." The inspector left. The door swung shut, damping the noise to a murmur. Bracken sat alone with the ledger, the letter, and the receipt book. He picked up the receipt book. The cover was soft, worn by many hands. He opened it to the page with Mrs. Fry's entry. The ink was dry. The transaction was closed. The child was dead. The sister was breathing. He closed the book. A sound drifted through the wall from the holding cells. Not a shout, not a cry. A tune, low, wheezing, barely audible through the plaster and lath, but distinct in the quiet room. It was a hymn, Golden Links. The melody stumbled over the notes, cheerful and utterly out of place in the gloom of the police court. Bracken froze. The pen rolled from his fingers, hitting the desk with a clatter. The singing continued, steady and bright, coming closer down the corridor. The warder was bringing the prisoner up for identification. Bracken looked at the blot on the page, then at the letter from reading, then at the door. He did not move to hide the papers. He did not reach for the handkerchief. He simply waited, his breath held tight in his chest as the footsteps stopped directly outside the room. The handle began to turn. The scratch of nib on paper sounded like a beetle trapped in a jar, frantic and dry, against the sudden quiet of the deposition room. Mrs. Fry sat opposite, her hands knotted in the lap of a dress that had seen better Sundays. The black wool faded to the color of dried blood. She did not look at Bracken, her gaze fixed on the inkwell, watching the dark liquid tremble with every shudder that racked her thin frame. Outside, the Thames police court roared with the business of drunkards and thieves, a cacophony of boots on flagstones and shouted pleas, but in here the air hung heavy, pressurized by the weight of unsaid things. "Proceed, Mrs. Fry," Bracken said. His voice came out flat, stripped of the warmth he felt clawing at his throat. "State the date again, for the record." "April," she whispered, the word fracturing in the air before she corrected herself. "No, March. It was March when I went to the house." "March 1896. "Yes, the 24th, or perhaps the 25th. She lifted a hand to her face, wiping at eyes that were already raw, the skin beneath them bruised purple from lack of sleep. "The days run together, sir, since they told me about the rapping." Bracken dipped his pen. The nib caught a glob of ink, swelling black and glossy, threatening to drip onto the pristine white sheet before he could guide it. He held it there, suspended, feeling the tiny vibration of the metal against his thumb, a nervous tick he could not suppress. He needed the syntax perfect, the grammar flawless. If the sentence structure held, perhaps the horror inside it would remain contained, locked away behind the bars of subordinate clauses and precise dates. "State what occurred upon your arrival at the premises in Kensington," he dictated, watching her lips move. "She opened the door," Mrs. Fry said, her voice gaining a strange, hollow strength. "She wore a cap, a widow's cap, crisp and white, pinned under her chin. She looked respectable, like a nurse or a matron from a charity ward." Bracken wrote. The accused presented herself in the attire of a widow, wearing a cap of white muslin. The words marched across the page, orderly and sane. They did not mention the way the woman's eyes had darted to the bundle in Mrs. Fry's arms, calculating the weight of the child against the weight of the sovereigns in her purse. They did not mention the smell of boiled cabbage and damp wool that clung to the hallway, masking something sweeter, something rotting beneath the floorboards. "She said the country air would do the baby good," Mrs. Fry continued. A tear escaped, tracking through the powder on her cheek. "She said Doris would grow strong, that she had a garden, a real garden with grass." "And you believed her?" "I wanted to." The confession tore out of her, sharp and sudden. "God help me, I wanted to believe there was a place where a child like mine could be safe, where the shame wouldn't follow us." Bracken's hand paused. The pen hovered over the word safe. He saw another woman then, not Mrs. Fry, but a girl from last winter, standing in this very room, her coat too thin for the frost biting off the river. She had come to him, desperate, clutching a birth certificate like a shield. He had been busy. The ledger was full, the court backlogged with vagrancy cases and assault charges that demanded immediate attention. He had told her to seek private adoption. He had used those exact words, private adoption. He had pointed her towards the newspapers, towards the columns where women like Amelia Dyer advertised their services with cheerful lies about healthy country homes and attentive care. He had signed her away with a wave of his hand, a bureaucratic gesture to clear his desk, and now that girl was likely screaming in a cell somewhere or dead in a ditch, because he had valued procedure over pity. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, doubling him over the desk, his breath catching in a ragged gasp. "Mr. Bracken," Mrs. Fry looked up, confusion cutting through her grief. "Are you unwell?" "The syntax," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You said she promised a garden. Did she specify the location?" "She said Reading," Mrs. Fry replied, the name hanging in the air between them like a verdict. "She said it was near Reading, where the air is clean." Bracken's stomach turned. Sarah was in Reading. His sister, coughing her lungs into a handkerchief stained with rust, waiting for his letters, waiting for the money he sent from his clerk's wage. The same town, the same clean air that Dyer sold as a commodity, a lie wrapped in a widow's cap. The connection snapped into place, a jagged line connecting his own life to this slaughterhouse, and he felt the floor tilt beneath his chair. He pressed the nib harder into the paper. The ink flowed too fast, a dark river flooding the fibers, stated that the accused claimed the residence was situated in the vicinity of Reading. The lie looked true on the page. That was the terror of it. The bureaucracy sanitized everything. It took a mother's desperation and a killer's greed and turned them into neat, legible lines that a judge could read without flinching. "Did she take the money?" Godley's voice cut through the room. The inspector had entered silently, looming in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floorboards to touch Mrs. Fry's boots. "We need the timeline of the payment established before the transfer of the child." Mrs. Fry flinched as if struck. "Yes, immediately. She counted it right there in the hall, and she didn't even look at the baby until the coins were in her pocket." "And the amount?" £10, Mrs. Fry whispered. "All I had." Godley nodded, pulling a notebook from his coat as he stated, "Right, £10. With motive established as greed, he looked at Bracken and instructed, "Make sure that's clear, Thomas." He explained that the exchange of currency preceded the handover, proving premeditation. "Premeditation," Bracken repeated. The word tasted like ash. He drove the pen down, the metal scraping against the paper, tearing a small jag in the surface. A tiny wound in the record. He stared at it, mesmerized by the flaw, the single place where the perfection of the document had failed, where the human hand had betrayed the machine. "She seemed so kind," Mrs. Fry said, her voice dropping to a murmur, addressing the table rather than the men. "She touched my arm. She said, 'Don't you worry, Mother. I'll treat her like my own.'" Bracken stopped writing. The pen rested on the tear in the paper, the ink pooling into the rip, spreading out like a bruise. He could hear it again faintly through the wall. The singing, Golden Links. The tune was cheerful, buoyant, utterly divorced from the devastation sitting 3 feet away in the form of a trembling woman who had sold her child for £10 and a promise of grass. Dyer was singing. In her cell, waiting to be brought up for identification, she was knitting or singing or perhaps just breathing the same air as the rest of them, untroubled by the grave she had filled. The banality of it made Bracken want to scream, to overturn the desk and scatter the papers like dead leaves, but he sat still. He folded his handkerchief, once, twice, into a smaller and smaller square until it vanished into his palm. "Is that all, Mrs. Fry?" Godley asked, his tone impatient, already turning towards the door. "We have others waiting." Mrs. Fry nodded slowly, as if her neck could no longer support the weight of her head. She stood up, her movements stiff, robotic. She smoothed her skirt, a gesture of dignity that broke Bracken's heart more than her tears. She turned to leave, her shawl slipping from her shoulder. As she passed the desk, something fluttered from her sleeve. It landed on the floorboards with a sound too light to be anything of value. A ribbon, blue silk, frayed at the edges, tangled with a lock of fine, pale hair. Bracken saw it hit the wood. He saw Mrs. Fry hesitate, her hand twitching towards the floor, but Godley was already opening the door, ushering her out into the noise of the corridor. She did not pick it up. She walked away, leaving the ribbon behind, a discarded scrap of a life that no longer existed. The door clicked shut. The room was silent again, save for the distant, cheerful hum of the hymn drifting through the plaster. Bracken looked at the ribbon, which lay there bright and obscene against the grey dust of the floor. Protocol demanded he log it as evidence item 44B. It was to be bagged, tagged, and filed alongside the flannel and the cord, becoming just another object in a museum of dead children. He stood up, his chair scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh shriek that silenced the singing in his head for a moment. He looked at the door, then back at the ribbon. Slowly, deliberately, he bent down. His fingers brushed the silk, cold and smooth. He did not reach for the evidence bag. Instead, he closed his fist around the ribbon, feeling the friction of the silk against his palm, the tiny tug of the hair caught in the knot. He straightened his coat and slid his hand into his pocket. The ribbon disappeared into the darkness of his lining, hidden against the wool, a secret weight settling next to his heart. He sat back down, picked up his pen, and smoothed the torn page flat. The ink had dried. The record was complete, but the lie remained, tucked safely in his pocket, waiting for the end. The ribbon burned against his thigh, a tiny coal of blue silk hidden in the dark wool of his trousers. Bracken sat rigid, the chair legs digging into the floorboards, as if he could anchor himself against the sudden, vertiginous shift in the room's gravity. The air still smelled of Mrs. Fry's damp shawl and the metallic tang of Godley's impatience, but beneath it lay something new, the scent of his own complicity. He had stolen from the crown. A petty theft, perhaps, unworthy of the gallows that waited for Dyer, yet it felt heavier than the stack of depositions on his desk. Outside, the corridor erupted. Boots clattered, a barrister shouted for his clerk, and the distant, rhythmic thud of a warder's baton against a cell door marked time. Life, noisy and indifferent, continued. Inside, the silence pressed against his eardrums, thick and suffocating. He looked down at the page. The tear he had made earlier gaped open, a jagged mouth in the pristine white paper, the ink bleeding into the fibers like a bruise spreading under skin. Premeditation. The words stared back at him, accusatory and cold. He dipped the pen. The nib hovered over the next line, trembling slightly. He needed to finish the notation. Exhibit A, receipt for £10 signed by the accused. Simple, clean, factual, but his hand refused to move. The memory of the ribbon's texture, the way the light had caught the frayed edge, overwhelmed the sterile logic of the court. It was not just evidence, it was Doris Marmon. A piece of the child who had worn it, who had been wrapped in it, who had been carried out of this very building in a box too small for a coffin. A shadow fell across the desk. Godley returned, wiping his hands on a handkerchief, his face flushed from the exertion of managing the crowd in the hall. He did not look at Bracken's face, but at the paper. "Finished?" Godley asked, his voice brisk, devoid of the earlier irritation. "We need this filed before the lunch recess. The magistrate wants the payment timeline on his bench by 2. Bracken blinked, the spell breaking. He forced his hand to move, the scratch of the nib sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Almost, sir, just finalizing the exhibit reference." "Good man." Godley leaned over, tapping a finger on the date. "April 4th. Make sure it's clear. That's 3 days before the body was found in the river, 3 days between the coin and the cord." 3 days. The math was simple, the arithmetic of death reduced to a subtraction problem. Bracken wrote the date, the loops of his script tight and controlled, betraying nothing of the storm churning beneath his waistcoat. He thought of the young woman he had turned away last November, the one with Thecedilla o sense grave eyes, and the baby wrapped in a shawl too thin for the frost. She had asked for advice, for a direction, for anything other than the workhouse. And he, Thomas Bracken, senior clerk, had told her that the court could not help, that private arrangements were sometimes the only way for a woman of her standing. He had pointed her towards the very market that Dyer cultivated, the shadowy network of adoption that thrived on desperation. Private adoption, the words tasted like bile. He had sanitized his own refusal with bureaucratic language, just as Dyer sanitized her murders with hymns and knitting. Was there any difference? One man sat behind a desk and directed a mother to a killer. The other woman took the money and tied the cord. Both actions resulted in the same silence, the same empty cradle. "Bracken," Godley's voice sharpened, "you're staring at the page." Bracken flinched, his hand jerking. A drop of ink fell from the nib, landing squarely on the word April, blooming into a black star that obscured the date. "Apologies, Inspector, the light, it plays tricks." "The gas is fine," Godley said, straightening up and glancing at the jet hissing softly above them. "Don't lose your focus now. We are close. Dyer's defense is trying to claim insanity, but the receipts tell a different story. Cold calculation, that's what we need to prove, not madness, commerce. Commerce, yes, that was the word. The buying and selling of flesh, processed through the same channels as coal or grain. Bracken picked up his blotter and pressed it gently onto the wet ink, absorbing the spill. The black stain remained, a permanent flaw in the record. He would have to rewrite the page, or perhaps leave it. Let the judge see the error. Let him see that the record was as fragile, as easily damaged, as the lives it described. No, Bracken said softly, more to himself than to Godley. Not madness, just business. What was that? Nothing, sir, I said. I will have it ready. Bracken reached for a fresh sheet of paper, pulling it from the stack with a crisp snap. He smoothed it out, aligning the edges with the desk's corner. The ritual of preparation calmed him, the familiar order of things reasserting itself. Fold the handkerchief, align the paper, dip the pen, write the truth, or at least the version of it that the law required. But the weight in his pocket pulled at him, a physical tether to the woman who had just left. Mrs. Fry. She had walked out into the London fog, leaving her child's memory on the floorboards. Would she go home to an empty room? Would she sit by the fire and wait for a letter that would never come, telling her that Doris was happy in the country, eating cream and running through fields of daisies? That was the lie Dyer sold. The country air, the healthy appetite, the peaceful sleep. Bracken began to write again, the script flowing smoother this time, the rhythm of the words taking over. Stated that the accused received the sum of £10 in gold sovereigns. He could hear the singing again, faint but distinct. Golden links. The hymn drifted through the walls, a cheerful melody that seemed to mock the darkness of the room. Dyer was singing it. He was sure of it. She was sitting in her cell, perhaps knitting another sock, her fingers moving with the same steady rhythm as his pen, both of them creating something out of nothing. One created death, the other created a record of it. Which was the greater sin? The door opened again, though this time it was not Godley. A warder stood there, his face grey and unreadable. "Inspector," he asked, "the prisoner is ready for the identification parade, and the magistrate is waiting." Godley nodded, snatching his hat from the rack before issuing his command. "Right. Come on, Bracken, and bring the file, for we need you to read the deposition aloud when we confront her with Fry's statement." Bracken stood, his knees stiff. He gathered the papers, stacking them neatly, the torn page and the stained one buried in the middle where they wouldn't be seen immediately. He placed his hand over his pocket, feeling the hard knot of the ribbon through the fabric. It felt warm now, heated by his body, as if it were alive. "Coming, sir," he said. They walked out into the corridor, joining the stream of lawyers, clerks, and reporters moving towards the courtroom. The noise was deafening, a roar of voices that bounced off the high, tiled walls. Bracken kept his eyes forward, focusing on the back of Godley's coat, trying to ignore the faces that brushed past him. He felt exposed, as if everyone could see the bulge in his pocket, as if the blue silk were glowing through the wool. As they passed the holding cells, the singing grew louder. It was coming from the last cell on the left, the one with the reinforced door, a woman's voice, clear and strong, rising above the din of the court. Gathered at the river where the trees never fade. Bracken slowed his step. Godley did not notice, pressing ahead through the crowd. Bracken paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough to hear the next line, the line that Dyer had sung to so many mothers before she strangled their children, and the shadows flee away. He tightened his grip on the file. The paper crinkled in his hand. He walked on, the melody following him down the hall, weaving through the noise of the living, a ghost song that promised rest but delivered only silence. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, heavy and dark. Beyond them waited Dyer and the dead, and the truth that he was about to read aloud in a voice that would not shake. He touched the ribbon one last time, a silent apology to the girl in the river, and stepped into the light. The paper smelled of damp wool and old sugar. Bracken peeled the top letter from the seized bundle, his thumb catching on a rough edge where the envelope had been torn open by rougher hands than his own. Cripplegate. The postmark was smudged, a black thumbprint of date and place that meant nothing to the sorting clerks, but everything to the woman who had pressed her thumb into the wax seal 3 weeks ago. He smoothed the sheet flat against the ledger, the ink on the page still wet from his own transcription of the previous exhibit, the words blurring slightly at the edges where the humidity of the room had softened the fibers. Mrs. E. Gable, 14 Union Street. The handwriting sloped upward, a desperate climb towards the margin, as if the writer hoped to escape the bottom of the page. Bracken read the first line, and the air in his lungs turned thick, heavy with the phantom scent of the lavender water his sister Sarah used to dab behind her ears before the fever took her voice. Dear Madam, I am in a situation of great distress, and have heard you take children into the country where the air is pure. He stopped. The nib of his pen hovered over the fresh sheet of deposition paper, a drop of ink swelling at the tip, dark and round as a pupil. He did not write. He just stared at the word country. It sat there on Gable's page, innocent and lethal, the same word Sarah had used in her last letter from Reading, describing the view from her window as if it were a medicine she could drink. The trees are coming out, Tom, she had written. It feels like the world is holding its breath. Gable's world had not been holding its breath. It had been strangling her. Bracken forced his hand down. The scratch of the nib was too loud, a dry rasp against the silence of the room. He transcribed the address, the date, the amount of the initial fee mentioned in the second paragraph, 5 shillings, a down payment on a grave. He copied the phrasing exactly, preserving the grammatical errors, the hesitant punctuation, the way Gable had crossed out the word illegitimate and written unfortunate above it, only to scratch that out too and leave a blank space where the truth should have been. I cannot keep him here, the landlord say, sir. The sentence trailed off. Gable had run out of paper or perhaps out of courage. Bracken knew the rest. He had heard it a dozen times this week alone. The landlord says there is no room. The landlord says the noise is intolerable. The landlord says a woman alone with a crying babe is a scandal waiting to happen. He turned the page. Another letter lay beneath, this one from a girl in Bethnal Green, the paper so thin it threatened to tear under the weight of the ink. If you could take her for a few weeks until I find a situation, I would pay you monthly. She is a good sleeper. She does not cry. Good sleeper. The phrase punched him in the gut, a physical blow that made him straighten in his chair. That was the advertisement, wasn't it? The promise Dyer sold to women who were drowning. A child who would not cry. A child who would sleep forever in the country air. Bracken's fingers trembled just slightly, a vibration that traveled up his wrist and settled in his shoulder. He reached for his spectacles, pulling them from his nose to wipe the lenses with his handkerchief, though the glass was already clear. He folded the linen, once, twice, into a small, tight square that vanished into his palm. He looked at the stack of letters. There were 12 of them, 12 women who had written to the same address, using the same hopeful tone, the same desperate logic that said someone else can do this better than me. They mirrored Sarah's letters so closely it felt like a trick of the light, a distortion in the glass of the window where the fog pressed against the pane. Sarah asked for money for medicine. These women asked for sanctuary for their sins. Both were appeals to a world that had no room for them. Both were transactions. Mr. Bracken. He jumped, the handkerchief crumpling in his fist. Godley stood in the doorway, his hat tilted low, shedding rain onto the floorboards. The inspector did not wait for an invitation. Stepping into the room with the heavy tread of a man who owned the ground, he walked on. Have you sorted the correspondence yet? Godley asked, shaking his umbrella. Water sprayed onto the legs of the desk. The magistrate wants the chain of custody verified before the afternoon session. We need to link the letters to the receipts found in her reticule. Nearly done, sir, Bracken said. His voice sounded thin, stretched tight over a hollow core. He picked up his pen again, dipping it into the well. The ink was cold. Just finishing the transcription of the Gable letter. It matches the receipt dated April 2nd. Good, Godley leaned over, peering at the page. His breath smelled of tobacco and stale coffee. Make sure you note the postmark. The defense will try to claim she never received them, that she was just a middlewoman who got confused. Bracken looked at the word country again. He thought of Amelia Dyer sitting in her cell, perhaps humming that hymn, Golden Links, while she counted the sovereigns from Mrs. Gable. Did she think of them as people, or just as entries in a ledger, columns of income and expense? She received them, Bracken said quietly. She answered this one, see. He pointed to a faint pencil note in the margin of Gable's letter, a scribble that looked like a calculation. A circumflex £1, tens, Balance due. She marked it for payment. Godley grunted, straightening up. That'll do then, get it filed. And Bracken. Yes, sir. Stop fretting over the handwriting. It's not your mother's diary, it's evidence. Godley turned to leave, his coat brushing the doorframe. Keep your head down. The press are out there like sharks smelling blood. They'll twist anything that looks like hesitation. The door clicked shut. Bracken was alone again with the dead women and their sleeping children. He looked at the pile of letters, the stack growing smaller as he worked through them, each one a tiny coffin made of paper. He picked up the next one, Mrs. H. Miller, Peckham. I know it is a lot to ask, but she is so small. She fits in one arm. He wrote it down. She fits in one arm. The words flowed onto the page, neat, precise, utterly devoid of the scream that was trapped inside them. He transcribed the plea, the promise of monthly payments, the description of the baby's blue eyes, the mention of the christening gown that was still white. He wrote it all in his perfect, legal script, the ink drying instantly in the warm, stale air of the room. When he finished the last letter, the stack was gone. The desk was clear except for his own deposition sheets, a neat pile of horror bound in twine. He sat back, his spine cracking with the movement. The silence in the room was not empty. It was full of the things he had just written, the voices of women who thought they were saving their children by giving them away. He reached for a fresh sheet of paper, not for the court, but for himself. He pulled his personal stationery from the drawer, the cream-colored stock contrasting sharply with the grey official forms. He dipped his pen. My dearest Sarah. He stopped, the nib hovered. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to write, I am surrounded by ghosts, Sarah, and they all sound like you. He wanted to confess that he had told a girl last winter to look for private adoption notices in the Telegraph, that he had pointed her towards the very market that ate children. He wanted to ask if she forgave him for being alive when so many were dead. The ink drop fell. It hit the paper and spread, a dark bloom on the cream surface. He crossed it out, a single, harsh line through the confession. The weather in London remains dreadfully wet, he wrote instead. The fog has lifted slightly, though the damp penetrates everything. I trust the air in reading is kinder to your chest. He signed his name, Thomas. He folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and placed it on the edge of the desk to be posted. Then he picked up the Dyer file, the weight of it familiar and crushing, and stood up. The clock on the wall ticked, a steady, indifferent rhythm that measured out the seconds until the next death, the next trial, the next lie. He walked to the door, his hand on the latch, and paused. Through the wood, he could hear the muffled roar of the court beyond, the sound of justice being grinding into shape, and he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like cold lead, that none of it would bring the sleepers back. The corridor to Newgate smelled of wet wool and boiled cabbage, a thick, greasy scent that clung to the back of the throat. Bracken walked it with his head down, the Dyer file tucked under his arm like a shield, though shields offered no protection against the inventory lists waiting in the governor's office. He needed to see the book. The mention of golden links in the seizure report had lodged in his mind, a splinter he could not dig out, forcing him to verify the juxtaposition with his own eyes before the trial turned the object into mere exhibit number 4. Name, the turnkey asked, not looking up from his ledger. A man of vast bulk, he occupied his stool as if it were a throne, his fingers stained with the same ink that ruined Bracken's cuticles. Bracken, Thames Court, regarding the Dyer holdings. The baby woman. The turnkey spat into a tin cup beside him, the sound sharp in the stone hallway. Cell block C, governor's expecting you. Don't touch anything unless he says. She's got a way of making things disappear, even behind bars. Bracken nodded, stepping past the gate as the iron groaned shut behind him. The sound echoed, a finality that vibrated in the soles of his boots. He followed the water down a passage where the gas jets hissed, casting long, dancing shadows that made the peeling paint on the walls look like running water. They stopped at a desk piled high with bundles tied in brown paper. The governor, a thin man with spectacles perched on the end of a nose that had seen too much sour milk, looked up with a weary blink. Mr. Bracken, here to certify the list. If you please, specifically the personal effects recovered from 41 Helston Road. The governor slid a sheet across the desk. The paper was rough, cheap stock that absorbed the light. Bracken leaned in, his eyes scanning the handwritten columns. One black reticule, worn, 3 baby shirts, calico, 1 policy, national provident, value a circumflex £5. His finger traced down the line, stopping where the ink had been pressed harder, as if the writer had hesitated there too. 1 hymn book, title, Golden Links, cover damaged. There it is, Bracken whispered, the words tasting like ash. May I? The governor waved a hand to dismiss the formality, insisting it was just a book, man, nothing more than pages and glue, with nothing holy about it now. Bracken reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and lifted the small bundle marked religious texts. He untied the string, the knot tight and unforgiving. Inside lay the book. It was smaller than he expected, the cloth cover faded to a muddy brown, the corners frayed where thumbs had rubbed them smooth. He opened it. The pages were yellowed, brittle with age and damp, smelling of mold and something sweeter, like dried lavender or perhaps old milk. He turned to the index, Golden Links. The title page bore no name, no inscription to claim ownership, yet the marginalia told a different story. Next to hymn number 142, There is a Happy Land, someone had written figures in pencil, not notes on the melody, but sums. A circumflex £2, tens, balance, due. The numbers sat beside the verses about angels and rest, a commercial ledger masquerading as devotion. Bracken felt a sudden, violent lurch in his stomach, the room tilting as if the floor had dropped away. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white, forcing himself to breathe through the nausea. It was the banality of it that struck him, the casual way salvation and strangulation had been filed in the same pocket. Dyer had not seen a contradiction. To her, the hymn promised a rest for the child, and the ledger ensured the mother paid for the ticket. See something interesting? The governor asked, lighting a pipe. The sulfur match flared, brief and bright, illuminating the deep lines of his face. Just annotations, Bracken managed, his voice tight. He closed the book quickly, as if shutting it would seal the horror back inside. She used it to calculate fees. Calculations are evidence, Mr. Bracken. Cold hard numbers don't lie, unlike witnesses. The governor blew a stream of smoke towards the ceiling, where it joined the grey haze hanging under the lights. You look pale. Sit down before you fall. We don't need another corpse in the inventory. I am quite well, Bracken lied, pushing the book back across the desk. His hands felt cold, the blood retreating from his fingers. Just the air in here, it's heavy. It's the dead weight of the city, the governor corrected, tapping ash into his tray. Gets into the mortar, you breathe it long enough, it settles in your lungs. You clerks, you think you're separate from it because you write it down, but you're just another part of the machinery, grinding it all up. Bracken did not answer. He gathered his file, his movements stiff, mechanical. The encounter had stripped him of his composure, leaving him raw and exposed. He needed to leave. He needed the open sky, even if the sky above London was just a lower ceiling of soot. He thanked the governor, a mumbled phrase that barely registered, and turned back towards the corridor. The walk back to the court felt longer than the journey there. The streets were crowded, the throng of workers heading home for supper pressing against him, shoulders brushing, bodies warm and alive. He moved through them like a ghost, unseen and untouchable. A newsboy shouted the evening edition, the headline screaming about the monster of reading, the words snatched by the wind before they could reach Bracken's ears. He ignored it. He focused on the pavement, on the placement of his feet, one after the other, a rhythm to keep the thoughts at bay. He reached his lodgings as the gas lamps were being lit, the flickering yellow glow casting long, distorted shadows against the brickwork. The stairwell smelled of cooking onions and damp plaster. He climbed to his room, unlocked the door, and stepped inside, closing the world out. The desk waited. The cream-colored stationery sat where he had left it, the sealed letter to Sarah resting on top. He stared at it for a moment, then sat down, pulling the paper towards him. He broke the seal. The wax crumbled under his thumb. He unfolded the sheet, reading the lie he had written. The fog has lifted slightly. A lie the fog had not lifted. It had thickened, wrapping around the city like a shroud, choking the breath from the living just as surely as the cord had choked the dead. He picked up his pen again. He had to add something. He could not send nothing but a weather report to a sister who might be dying. "My dearest Sarah," he wrote at the top of a new page, the nib scratching loudly in the quiet room, "I have been thinking of you constantly. The work here is difficult, more so than I let on. There are cases, women who write to me, or rather to the court, seeking help they cannot find. I worry that I am not doing enough, that my position, my adherence to the rules, prevents me from offering the kindness they need." He paused, the pen hovering. The truth sat on the tip of the nib, ready to flow. "I sent a girl to her death, Sarah. I told her to advertise. I told her it was a solution." The words clamored in his throat, desperate to be released. He pressed the nib to the paper. "The rules are strict," he wrote instead. "One must follow procedure. It is the only way to maintain order." He stopped. The sentence hung there, sterile and useless. It explained nothing. It offered no comfort. It was the voice of the clerk, not the brother. He looked at the confession he had almost made, the raw nerve of his guilt exposed for a split second before being covered over by the bandage of bureaucracy. He could not send this. He could not burden her with the rot inside him. She needed hope, not the reality of a man drowning in ink. He took the fresh sheet, the one with the half-truth, and crumpled it. The paper resisted, then gave way, crushing into a tight ball in his fist. He tossed it into the grate, where it landed on the cold ashes, for he would burn it later. For now, he would send the lie because it was safer, and because the lie kept her clean. He resealed the original letter, pressing the wax hard until it cooled. He placed it by the door, ready for the morning post. Then he sat back, exhaustion washing over him, a tide that pulled him down into the chair. He closed his eyes, but the image of the hymn book remained, the numbers scrawled next to the verses about the happy land. A knock at the door startled him. He jumped, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Mr. Bracken," the landlady's voice, muffled by the wood, called out. "Message for you, it is from the court." Bracken stood, his legs stiff, and opened the door. She handed him a small envelope, the official crest stamped in red. He tore it open. "The trial date is confirmed for May 21st at the Old Bailey, so we must prepare the final depositions." The date swam before his eyes. May, only a month away. A month to finalize the record of dozens of dead children. A month to ensure the syntax was perfect while the world waited for a hanging. "Thank you," he said, his voice automatic. He closed the door and leaned against it, the paper crinkling in his hand. He had to go out. He had to walk. The room was too small, the air too thin. He grabbed his hat and coat, stepping back out into the night. The fog had indeed thickened, just as he had lied to Sarah. It rolled along the pavement, obscuring the feet of the passers-by, turning the street lamps into halos of diffuse, sickly light. He walked without direction, letting the current of the crowd carry him. He passed a group of women laughing outside a pub, their faces flushed with gin and warmth. He passed a beggar huddled in a doorway, wrapped in rags that offered no protection against the damp. Then he saw her. A nursemaid pushing a pram along the edge of the pavement. She was humming, a tuneless, rhythmic sound that cut through the murmur of the street. The pram was covered with a white linen sheet, pinned neatly at the corners. The wheels creaked, a high-pitched squeal that matched the sound of the pen on paper. Bracken stopped, his breath caught in his throat, sharp and painful. The nursemaid turned a corner, the pram tilting slightly as she navigated the uneven stones. For a second, just a fraction of a second, the shape beneath the linen looked small, too small, the angle of the head, the stillness of the form. "Doris!" The name screamed in his head, silent and deafening. He stumbled forward, his hand reaching out, fingers grasping at the empty air. The nursemaid glanced back, her eyes widening in alarm at the sight of a man lunging towards her in the fog. She pulled the pram closer, shielding it with her body. "Sir," her voice was sharp, defensive. "Keep back." Bracken froze, the illusion shattered. It was just a child sleeping, just a nursemaid doing her job. He was not in Helston Road. He was not in the river. He was on a London street, breathing the coal smoke, alive. He lowered his hand, shame burning his cheeks as he stammered, I beg your pardon," his voice cracking under the weight of his error. "I thought," he began, then faltered. "I mistook you for someone." The nursemaid stared at him for a moment longer, then sniffed, turning away with a huff of dismissal. She continued walking, the wheels creaking, the humming resuming, fading into the fog. Bracken stood rooted to the spot. He reached out and grabbed the iron railing of the nearest lamppost, the cold metal biting into his palm. He leaned his weight against it, his chest heaving as he tried to draw air into lungs that felt filled with water. The fog swirled around his ankles, hiding the ground, hiding the path, hiding everything but the echo of a name that belonged to a child who would never wake up. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids, the ledger pages turned themselves, one by one, forever. The nib caught on a fiber in the paper, skipping before depositing a blot of black that spread like a bruise. Bracken did not blot it. To stop now would be to admit the words mattered more than the record, and the record was the only thing holding the roof up. Below the clerk's box, Amelia Dyer smoothed the front of her black dress, fingers pressing flat against the fabric as if ironing out invisible creases, and smiled at the judge with the benign confidence of a woman discussing the price of eggs rather than the disposal of infants. "The insurance costs more than the adoption fee, you see," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the gallery without any need for projection, bright and tidy. "So one must be practical about which clothes the child wears when they go to the country." Gaslight hissed overhead, smelling of sulfur and burnt dust. Bracken dipped his pen, the steel nib glinting under the gas jets. The inkwell smelled of iron gall and old vinegar. He wrote practical. The word looked obscene on the page, surrounded by the neat copperplate of dates and names, yet there it sat, solid and unarguable. He wanted to scrape the paper until it tore, to destroy the syntax that made her logic sound reasonable, but his hand moved with the automatic precision of 30 years' service, transcribing the banality without flinching, because flinching was not in the procedure. "Are you suggesting," the defense counsel asked, leaning forward until his waistcoat strained, "that the clothing was selected for economy alone?" "For economy and cleanliness," Dyer replied, turning her head slightly to include Bracken in her audience, though her eyes slid past him to the wall. "A child wrapped in clean wool travels better. It soothes the mother to know the baby is warm." A murmur rippled through the women in the gallery, a sound like dry leaves skittering on stone, but Bracken kept his eyes on the ledger. He had walked through the fog last night seeing ghosts in prams, hallucinating the shape of Doris Marmon beneath a linen sheet, and now here was the source of that phantom, speaking of warmth while the bodies cooled in the mortuary trays. He pressed the nib harder. The metal tines splayed. If he pushed too hard, the ink would pool, a black lake on the white surface, but he needed the pressure to anchor himself against the vertigo of her tone. She did not shout, nor did she weep. She offered them arithmetic instead of apology, and the courtroom accepted it because the alternative was to scream. "Did you receive letters?" the counsel pressed. "Many," with a quick bob of her chin, she nodded, "for mothers are anxious and require reassurance." Bracken wrote reassurance. The loop of the R tangled with the E. He thought of Sarah's letters from reading, the shaky script asking for money she knew he did not have, the desperate hope that her brother could fix what the doctors could not. It was the same hunger. These women in the gallery wanted salvation wrapped in brown paper and posted to the country, just as he wanted health wrapped in medicine and posted to his sister, and both transactions were lies sold by people who knew the cost of hope. He stopped writing. The pen hovered above the line, trembling slightly. "Mr. Bracken," the judge's voice cut through the haze, sharp as a gavel strike, "are you taking this down?" "Yes, my lord." The words came out flat, devoid of the panic tightening his chest. "I have the statement." "Then proceed." He lowered the pen. The tip touched the paper. Dyer was watching him now, really watching him, with a look of mild curiosity usually reserved for a shopkeeper weighing out tea, and she waited for him to capture her next calculation, ready to explain how death could be balanced in a ledger if only one kept the columns straight. Dyer smoothed her skirt again, the silk whispering against the wood of the witness box. She did not look at the jury. She looked at her own hands, resting pale and calm on the railing. "Sickly ones cost more to keep," she said, the words dropping into the well of the court with the weight of stones. "If a child was weak, The feeding took extra milk. Extra milk meant extra expense. One had to consider the outcome. Bracken's nib hovered. Outcome, a neutral word for death. He wrote it. The ink flowed too fast, pooling in the cross of the T. He did not blot it. His thumb began to move against his forefinger, the ragged cuticle catching on the skin, a nervous friction that had worn the flesh raw weeks ago. Below him, Dyer explained the mathematics of starvation with the cheerful diligence of a housekeeper balancing the weekly accounts. She spoke of weak lungs and poor appetites as one might speak of damp linens or sour milk, inconveniences to be managed rather than tragedies to be mourned. The gaslights hissed. A fly buzzed against the hot glass of a globe, beating itself stupid against the barrier. Bracken wrote expense. He wrote consider. His hand felt detached from his wrist, a mechanical claw executing orders from a brain that had stopped processing the meaning of the words. He heard Sarah's cough in the rhythm of Dyer's voice, the wet rattle of his sister's chest in reading mirroring the weak lungs in the box. He saw the letters piled on his own table at home, pleas for help he could not answer, and here was this woman answering them with gin and brown paper. His pen struck the ledger once, twice. The sound was small, dry wood on hard paper, but in the hushed court it landed like a pistol shot. Bracken did not stop. His thumb tapped the pen shaft, a staccato rhythm matching the ticking of the clock high on the wall, a frantic beat that quickened as Dyer detailed the disposal of a child who had cried too much. Tap, tap, tap. The ink splattered. A single dot landed on the word practical, staining the logic like a bruise. Mr. Bracken. The voice came from the bench, low and devoid of patience. Baron Pollock did not raise his head. He continued to examine a document before him, his spectacles sliding down the bridge of his nose, but the pause in his reading was absolute. The counsel stopped mid-question. The jury shifted in their seats, leather creaking. Even Dyer paused, her mouth slightly open, waiting to see if she should continue her account of economy while the clerk lost his mind. Bracken froze. The pen remained pressed against the paper, the nib digging a tiny trench into the fiber. He could feel the eyes of the gallery on his back, a physical heat pricking through his frock coat. He was 42 years old. He had served this court for 30. He did not tremble. He did not falter. He was the record. The record did not shake. He lifted the pen. The nib came away with a sticky sound. My lord. The apology stuck in his throat, dry as dust. He swallowed it. To speak was to admit fault. To admit fault was to break the illusion of neutrality that protected them all. He placed the pen carefully on the ledger, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the book. He folded his hands. He looked at the judge. Proceed, Pollock said, turning a page so that the sound of paper rustling became deafening. Bracken picked up the pen. His fingers were stiff, the joints locking against the movement. He forced them to curl around the shaft. He looked at Dyer. She was watching him again, that same mild curiosity, as if his lapse were merely a minor error in calculation, easily corrected. She did not look angry. She looked relieved, perhaps, to have a moment to breathe, to let the horror of her own words settle into the woodwork before she spoke them again. The outcome, Dyer resumed, picking up her thread as if no interruption had occurred, was usually peaceful. They went to sleep. Bracken wrote peaceful. The lie scorched the page. He wanted to stand. He wanted to walk to the box and shake her until the teeth rattled in her skull, until the cheerful mask slipped and showed the rot beneath. He wanted to scream that there was no peace in a ditch by the river, no economy in a strangled cry. But he sat. He wrote. He transcribed the lie into truth because that was the law. The law did not care about the noise in his head. The law cared only that the words were captured accurately. His thumb began to twitch again. He pressed it hard against the side of the ledger, using the pain to anchor himself. The wood of the desk was cold under his elbows. The ink smelled of vinegar and iron, a sharp tang that filled his nose and masked the scent of the crowd, the unwashed wool and stale breath of the men standing behind him. He focused on the smell. He focused on the grain of the wood. He focused on anything but the woman speaking about sleep. Dyer finished her sentence. The counsel asked another. The machinery of the trial ground on, gears meshing despite the friction. Bracken wrote until his wrist cramped, the muscles knotting into hard cords under the skin. He wrote until the light from the high windows began to fail, the grey afternoon deepening into the gloom of early evening. The gaslights flared brighter, casting long, dancing shadows that made the faces in the jury box look like skulls. Enough for today. As Pollock's gavel came down, the sound was final, a full stop to the day's horror. Adjourn until 10 tomorrow. The room exhaled, chairs scraped, men stood and stretched, their joints popping in the sudden noise. Bracken did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the ledger, staring at the word peaceful until the letters blurred into black smudges. He needed to move. He needed to walk. He needed to get out of the box and into the air before the walls closed in completely. He closed the ledger. The leather cover felt heavy, weighted with the day's accumulation of lies. He stood up, his legs stiff, and turned towards the gallery. The crowd was dispersing, a slow shuffle of coats and bonnets towards the doors, but some remained. They lingered near the railings, women mostly, their faces turned towards the box where Dyer was being uncuffed. Bracken's eyes found them. They were pale, drawn thin by worry and lack of sleep. They did not look at Dyer. They looked at the floor, at their hands, at each other. They wore the same expression he saw in the mirror every morning when he thought of reading. The look of people who had done everything right and still found themselves ruined. He gripped the edge of the clerk's box, his knuckles white, feeling a sudden, terrifying pull towards them, a need to speak, to warn, to confess that he was no better than the woman in the box. A warder touched Dyer's arm. She turned to leave. Bracken took a breath, the air thick with dust and expectation, and prepared to step down into the crowd. The warder's hand on Dyer's sleeve was not a shove but a guide, a gentle steering of livestock towards the pen, and she went willingly, her bonnet slightly askew, revealing a strand of grey hair that had escaped its pins to curl against her temple like a question mark. Bracken watched her turn, expecting a grimace, a flash of the fury that must surely be curdling in her gut now that the performance was over, but there was nothing. Only a slight adjustment of her shawl, a smoothing of the fabric over her knees, as if she were settling into a pew rather than being led back to the silence of a cell. She moved through the gap in the railings, the crowd parting for her not out of respect, but out of a primal, recoiling instinct, the way water flows around a stone that has been heated in a fire. Bracken stepped down from the box. His boots hit the flagstones with a dull thud, the sound lost immediately in the murmur of the dispersing court. He should have gone to the clerk's room, to the warm stove, and the pot of tea that would be waiting, stale and bitter, but his feet carried him towards the gallery rail instead. The women were still there, clustered like moths near a dying flame, their hands clasped so tightly the knuckles showed white through the worn wool of their gloves. One of them, a small woman in a faded brown coat, was staring at the empty dock, her mouth moving silently, forming words that made no sound. Praying, or perhaps reciting a letter she had sent months ago, a plea that had ended up in a basket beside a pair of shears. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror 3 weeks ago when he opened the post from reading and found Sarah's handwriting cramped and faint, the ink blotched where a tear had fallen before the nib touched the paper. "The cough is worse, Tom," she had written. "The doctor says the air in the valley is too damp, but the rent here is all we can afford." The same helplessness. The same terrifying realization that the world was a machine designed to grind people like her into dust, and that no amount of pleading, no amount of moral rightness could stop the gears. Bracken felt a sudden, sharp pressure behind his eyes, a physical ache that had nothing to do with the gaslight glare. He wanted to reach out, to touch the shoulder of the woman in brown, to tell her that he understood, that he too was trapped in the machinery, but his hands remained at his sides, stiff and useless. A man bumped into him, muttering an apology without looking back, his briefcase clattering against Bracken's thigh. The contact broke the spell. Bracken stepped back, his heel catching on the edge of a floorboard, and turned away before the woman in brown could see his face. He could not offer comfort. He could not offer anything. To speak would be to admit that the law he served was a sieve, that it caught the small thieves and the drunkards, but let the true horrors slip through until it was too late. He walked towards the door, his head down, focusing on the pattern of the tiles beneath his feet to avoid meeting the gaze of anyone else. "Mr. Bracken." The voice was soft, conversational, entirely out of place in the cacophony of the closing court. He stopped. He did not want to turn. Every instinct in his body, every nerve ending that had been frayed raw by 6 hours of transcription, screamed at him to keep walking, to push through the doors and into the cool, dirty air of the Strand. But the voice had used his name. It had claimed him. He turned slowly. Dyer stood near the exit, flanked by two warders who were waiting for her to move. She had paused, ignoring their subtle urging, and was looking directly at him. Her expression was not one of malice nor of appeal. It was polite, friendly even, the look one neighbor might give another when meeting on the pavement to discuss the price of coal. She tilted her head, a small bird-like motion, and her lips curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Thank you for your patience today," she said. Her voice carried clearly across the few yards of empty space between them, cutting through the ambient noise as if the room had suddenly been stripped of sound. "It must be tedious work, writing down everything someone says, especially when they speak so much." Bracken opened his mouth. No sound came out. His throat felt as if it had been packed with cotton wool, dry and suffocating. He wanted to tell her that it was not tedious. It was torture. It was the slow accumulation of poison, drop by drop, until the vessel overflowed. He wanted to tell her that he had written the word peaceful and felt his soul fracture. But he said nothing. He could not. The protocol of the court, the invisible armor of his profession, locked his jaw in place. Dyer nodded, seemingly satisfied with his silence, or perhaps interpreting it as the deference it was not. "Tomorrow, then," she said, "we have more to discuss. The clothes, you know, the insurance policies. People forget how important the details are." She turned then, allowing the warders to guide her through the door, her footsteps light on the stone, disappearing into the corridor where the shadows were already deepening. The door swung shut behind her with a heavy click, sealing her away, but the image of her smile remained burned into Bracken's vision, bright and terrible against the gloom. He stood alone in the emptying court. The cleaners were already arriving, brooms scraping against the floor, dust rising in clouds that caught the light of the gas jets. The smell of stale tobacco and damp wool was being replaced by the sharp scent of lye soap as the women began to scrub the benches. Bracken looked down at his hands. They were covered in ink. Not smudges, not the usual faint staining of the fingers, but a thick black coating that seemed to have seeped into the pores, into the lines of his palms, into the very texture of his skin. He rubbed them together, trying to wipe the residue onto his handkerchief, but the blackness did not fade. It seemed to spread, creeping up his wrists, darkening the cuffs of his shirt. He rubbed harder. The skin grew red and raw, stinging with the friction, but the ink remained, a permanent brand of the day's work. He could feel the grit of it under his nails, the slickness of it on his thumbs. It was as if the words he had written had leaked out of the ledger and onto his flesh, marking him as complicit, as one of the scribes of this particular hell. He clenched his fists, trying to hide the stain, but the blackness showed through the gaps in his fingers, undeniable and absolute. A cleaner brushed past him, dipping a rag into a bucket of grey water. "Closing up, sir," the man said, not unkindly. "Gas'll be out soon." Bracken nodded, though the man was not looking at him. He turned towards the door, his hands held stiffly at his sides, away from his coat, away from his body, as if they belonged to someone else. The corridor outside was dark, the gaslights flickering low, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched towards him like grasping fingers. He began to walk, his footsteps echoing on the stone, the sound of a man carrying a weight that no amount of scrubbing could ever remove. The door to the street awaited, heavy and iron-bound, promising air that smelled of horse manure and coal smoke, anything but this cloying, ink-stained silence. He reached for the handle, his blackened fingers leaving a smear on the brass, and pushed out into the night. The box lids scraped back. Wood on wood, a dry rasp that set Bracken's teeth on edge. Inside lay the yellow flannel, folded with a precision that mocked the violence it had witnessed. It smelled of river mud, of decay held in suspension by the cold water, a cloying sweetness that rose to meet him as the seal broke. He dipped his pen. The nib hovered over the ledger, trembling slightly, a black drop gathering at the tip like a bruise waiting to burst. "Exhibit 4, the prosecutor said. His voice was flat, devoid of the horror that should have filled the room. "The garment found upon the body of the infant Doris Marmon." Bracken wrote, "yellow flannel." The ink flowed too easily, the letters forming with a neatness that felt obscene. How could such tidy script describe something so ruined? The fabric was stiff, stained with the brown slime of the Thames, the fibers matted together where the water had done its work. He forced his eyes to track the details, to note the tear near the shoulder, the missing button, the way the hem had been turned up twice, as if to accommodate a growing child who would never grow. And the ligature. The inspector lifted the rope from the box. It was coarse, cheap stuff, the kind used for tying parcels or securing crates in a warehouse, not a tool of murder in the minds of most men, just a piece of string. But here, coiled in the palm of a gloved hand, it became a snake, a noose, a thing that had tightened around a neck no thicker than a man's wrist. Bracken's stomach lurched. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles whitening against the dark wood. Coarse hemp, the inspector continued, turning the rope so the light caught the frayed ends. Found knotted at the nape, tight enough to leave a mark, deep enough to stop the breathing. Coarse hemp rope, Bracken transcribed. His hand moved automatically, the muscle memory of years taking over while his mind screamed. He wanted to throw the pen across the room. He wanted to stand up and shout that this was not evidence, this was a child's skin, a child's last breath, a child's mother weeping in a lodging house 3 streets away. But he sat, he wrote. The scratch of the nib against the paper was the only sound in the court, a rhythmic ticking that measured out the seconds of a life ended too soon. Describe the knot, the judge ordered. His voice was weary, burdened by the sheer volume of death that had passed through this room in the last month. A simple reef knot, the inspector said, pulled tight. The ends were cut short, no attempt to hide it. Bracken paused. The ink pooled on the page, a small black lake that threatened to soak through to the next line. He blotted it quickly, pressing the paper too hard, leaving a grey smudge that looked like a fingerprint. Reef knot, ends cut short. The words sat on the page, sterile and cold. They did not capture the way the rope had bitten into the flesh, the purple groove that the coroner had described with clinical detachment. They did not capture the silence of the grave where the child now lay, waiting for a verdict that would not bring her back. He looked up. Dyer was watching him again. She sat in the dock, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of benign indifference. She did not look at the rope. She did not look at the flannel. She looked at Bracken, her eyes bright and curious, as if she were trying to decipher the code of his transcription. Did she know what he was writing? Did she care? Or was she simply waiting for her turn to speak, to explain away the yellow flannel and the coarse hemp with a story about insurance and adoption fees? The defense has no questions regarding the nature of the items, the prosecutor asked. None, the defense counsel replied. He was a young man, new to the bar, his face pale and sweaty under the gaslights. He shuffled his papers, avoiding the box, avoiding the rope, avoiding the eyes of the judge. We accept the chain of custody. The items are as described. As described, the phrase hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as described, as if the description could contain the reality, as if the words yellow flannel and coarse hemp could encompass the totality of a life extinguished. Bracken felt a sudden urge to laugh, a hysterical bubble rising in his chest that he swallowed down with a gulp of stale air. He picked up his handkerchief and began to clean his spectacles. The linen was already immaculate, but he folded it anyway, creasing the fabric into smaller and smaller squares until it disappeared into his palm. Proceed, the judge said. The inspector placed the rope back in the box. He folded the flannel over it, tucking the edges in with a care that bordered on reverence. Then he closed the lid, the scrape of wood on wood again, final and absolute. The evidence was sealed away, ready to be stored in a cupboard until the trial was over, until the hanging was done, until the whole sordid business was filed away under B for baby farming, alongside theft and vagrancy. Bracken looked down at his page. The lines were straight, the spelling perfect, the grammar flawless. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision. It was a lie. It captured nothing of the smell, nothing of the weight, nothing of the terrible, crushing silence that had fallen over the room when the rope was lifted from the box. He dipped his pen again, the nib scratching against the paper as he wrote the date. May 1896. The ink flowed dark and wet, a river of black that seemed to have no end. Outside, the city roared. Carts rumbled over the cobbles, horses neighed, men shouted orders to one another. Life went on, indifferent and relentless. But in here, in this gaslit room, time had stopped. It had stopped the moment the box was opened, the moment the yellow flannel was revealed, the moment the rope was lifted into the light. And Bracken was trapped in that stopped time, a scribe in a temple of death, writing down the words that would seal a woman's fate while failing to save the children who were already gone. He turned the page. The fresh paper was white and blank, waiting for the next horror, the next deposition, the next piece of evidence that would be described but never truly known. He smoothed it down with his ink-stained hand, leaving a faint grey mark on the corner, a signature of sorts, a mark of the man who wrote it all down, who bore witness in the only way he knew how, with a pen and a ledger and a heart that was slowly turning to stone. "Call the next witness," the clerk announced. The door opened. A woman entered, her face drawn and pale, her eyes red from weeping. She walked to the stand, her steps hesitant, her hands clutching a small bundle of letters. Bracken watched her, his pen poised. He knew what she would say. He knew the story she would tell, the desperate hope that had led her to Dyer, the money she had paid, the child she had lost. He had heard it a dozen times before. He would hear it a dozen times again. He dipped his pen. The ink flowed. The scratch of the nib began anew, a rhythmic ticking that measured out the seconds of another life destroyed. And Bracken wrote, because that was all he could do. He wrote until his hand cramped, until his eyes blurred, until the words lost their meaning and became nothing more than marks on a page, black on white, silence on silence. The woman began to speak. Her voice was a whisper barely audible over the scratching of the pen. Bracken leaned forward, straining to catch every word, to transcribe every sob, every pause, every break in the voice that spoke of a love that had been sold for a few pounds and a promise of safety. He wrote it all down. He made a record. He bore witness. And he wondered, as the ink dried on the page, if anyone would ever read it, if anyone would ever understand the weight of the words he had written, the weight of the evidence that lay in the box, the weight of the child who would never grow up. The gaslight flickered, a shadow passed across the page. Bracken blinked, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. The ink smudged, a dark streak across the white paper. He cursed under his breath, reaching for the blotter. But the damage was done. The record was flawed. The perfect transcription was ruined. He stared at the smudge, feeling a sudden, irrational surge of panic. It was just a mark, a tiny imperfection in a sea of words. But it felt like a crack in the dam, a sign that the whole structure was about to collapse, that the weight of it all was too much to bear. He took a deep breath. The air smelled of dust and old paper, of lye soap and stale tobacco. He picked up his pen again. The nib was bent, the flow of ink uneven. He straightened it with his thumbnail, careful not to press too hard. Then he began to write again, the scratch of the nib filling the silence, the words flowing onto the page, one after another, a river of ink that would never run dry. The woman was still speaking. Her voice had grown stronger, more urgent. She was describing the letters she had written, the promises she had received, the day she had handed her child over. Bracken wrote it all down. He did not look up. He did not meet her eyes. He kept his head down, his focus on the page, on the words, on the record. It was the only way to survive, the only way to keep from screaming. The box sat on the table, closed and sealed while it waited. Inside lay the yellow flannel and the coarse hemp rope. Inside lay the truth. Bracken wrote and wrote and wrote, trying to capture that truth in words that could never be enough. A crisp edge of folded paper sliced against Thomas Bracken's thumb as the court usher dropped a letter onto his ledger, the white rectangle landing with a soft, final thud beside the inkwell. "Post for you, Mr. Bracken, came by the afternoon delivery." Bracken flinched, the sudden intrusion of the outside world fracturing the rhythmic trance of transcription. He set his pen down, the nib leaving a tiny, unintended blob of black on the margin where the mother's testimony regarding the Golden Links hymnbook had trailed off mid-sentence. The woman on the stand paused, her mouth still open around a syllable of grief, waiting for the scribe to catch up. He nodded once, a sharp, mechanical jerk of the chin, and slid the letter under his palm without looking at the handwriting. He knew the slant of those loops, the desperate upward tilt of the S in Sarah. "Proceed," he said, his voice flat, stripped of any inflection that might suggest a man had just received news that could alter the course of his life. The woman resumed, her words tumbling out now faster, as if the brief silence had broken a dam she had been holding back with sheer physical effort. She spoke of the fever, the doctor's visit, the cost of the specialist in reading who demanded payment before he would even lift his stethoscope. Bracken's hand moved across the page, the scratch of the nib loud in the sudden quiet of the room, translating her panic into the sterile, passive voice of the law. That the deponent did seek assistance for the medical care of her infant, and being unable to secure funds, did place the child in the care of the prisoner. He wrote the words. They sat on the page, neat and orderly, lying by their very precision. The coincidence struck him like a physical blow to the solar plexus, doubling him over internally while his spine remained rigid against the hard wooden chair. Here was a mother selling a child to pay for a doctor, and in his pocket, or perhaps on his desk at home, lay a letter from his own sister detailing the exact same arithmetic of despair. Sarah needed a specialist. This woman had lost her child because she could not afford one. The circle closed, tight and suffocating, a noose made of ledger entries and unpaid bills. "Did the prisoner give you a receipt?" the barrister asked, leaning forward, his voice cutting through the woman's trembling narrative. "Yes, sir, a printed card, with a stamp." "And did she mention the cost of the adoption fee in relation to your medical expenses?" She said it was a mercy, that the money would save the others." The woman's hands twisted in her lap, knuckles white, tearing at a handkerchief that had already been reduced to a sodden ball of linen. "She said one must be practical, that the insurance costs more than the fee, so we had to choose which child lived." Bracken's pen stopped. The ink pooled at the tip of the nib, swelling into a dark, trembling sphere that threatened to drop and ruin the line below. He stared at it, mesmerized by the physics of the fluid, the way gravity pulled it down despite his attempt to hold it back. It was the same logic Sarah would soon be forced to employ. If the specialist cost 5 guineas and his savings were 3, what then? What did a clerk with ink-stained cuticles and a turned coat do when the mathematics of survival no longer balanced? He wiped the nib on the edge of the inkwell, the metal clinking softly against the glass. "Continue," he whispered, though no one heard him over the barrister's next question. The testimony droned on, a litany of dates and sums that sounded increasingly like a eulogy for a child who was still breathing when the transaction began. Bracken transcribed it all, his handwriting becoming tighter, more cramped, as if he were trying to fit the enormity of the tragedy into the smallest possible space. He thought of Sarah's last letter, the one where she had joked about the view from her window, masking the rattle in her chest with a forced cheerfulness that now seemed cruel in its optimism. She had not asked for money then. She had only hinted at the cold. Now the hint had become a demand, polite but urgent, delivered by the very hand that had just signed away another mother's hope. The woman finished. Her voice broke on the final word, a jagged shard of sound that hung in the gaslit air before dissolving into the general murmur of the court. She stepped down, her legs seeming to buckle slightly as she navigated the narrow aisle between the benches, her eyes fixed on the floor as if afraid to meet the gaze of anyone who might judge her for having survived. Bracken watched her go, the letter under his palm burning against his skin. He wanted to call out. He wanted to ask her the name of the specialist, the cost of the consultation, whether there was any way to reverse the transaction, to buy the child back before the river claimed it. But the rules of the court, the sacred architecture of procedure that held his world together, forbade such questions. He was a scribe, not a savior. His duty was to the record, to the perfect, unassailable truth of the text, not to the messy, bleeding reality of the people who generated it. He lifted his hand from the letter. The paper was warm, damp with the sweat of his palm. He folded it quickly, tucking it into the inner pocket of his frock coat, right next to his heart, where the rhythm of his pulse hammered against the thin envelope. "Adjourned until tomorrow," the magistrate announced, banging his gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden stillness. Chairs scraped, feet shuffled. The crowd began to disperse, eager to escape the heaviness of the room, to breathe the coal smoke of the street which suddenly seemed preferable to the scent of grief and old paper inside. Bracken remained seated, his hands resting on the ledger, the ink on his fingers beginning to dry and crack. He looked down at the page he had just filled. The words were perfect. The grammar was flawless. The tragedy was complete. Inspector Godley appeared at his elbow, looming large and solid in the dim light, smelling of wet wool and cheap tobacco. "Good work, Bracken," the inspector said, clapping a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Clear as a bell. She'll hang on those words alone. Bracken stood up, his knees popping with the movement, and gathered his papers into a neat stack. He tapped the edges on the desk to align them perfectly, a nervous tick that betrayed the turmoil churning in his gut. The record must be accurate, Bracken replied, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. Accurate and deadly, Godley grinned, a grim expression that didn't reach his eyes. Come on, I'm buying a pint. You look like you've seen a ghost. No ghosts, Bracken said, buttoning his coat over the letter in his pocket. Just the truth. They walked out into the corridor, the noise of the crowd swelling around them, a roar of voices discussing the weather, the politics, the price of fish, anything but the yellow flannel and the rope. Bracken walked beside Godley, his step measured, his face a mask of professional indifference, but inside the letter burned. It burned with the heat of a feverish brow in reading, with the cost of a specialist, with the terrible, calculating silence of a sister who knew her brother could not save her any more than he could save the child of the woman who had just left the stand. The street outside was slick with rain, the gas lamps reflecting in the puddles like distorted stars. Godley hailed a cab, shouting over the rumble of a passing dray, but Bracken barely heard him. He touched the pocket of his coat again, feeling the sharp corner of the envelope through the fabric. One drink, Godley insisted, steering him towards the pub on the corner. Then you can go home to your ledgers. Bracken nodded, allowing himself to be led, his feet moving automatically over the wet pavement. He would have the drink. He would listen to Godley talk about the mud and the tides, and then he would go home, to the silence of his lodgings, and he would open the letter. He would read the words he already knew by heart, the plea for help that he could not answer, the mirror of a tragedy he had just spent all day transcribing. The pub door swung open, releasing a cloud of thick blue smoke that smelled of burnt hops and despair. Bracken stepped inside, the warmth hitting him like a physical weight, and for a moment he wondered if this was what it felt like to drown on dry land. A collective gasp, sharp and ragged, tore through the gallery as the foreman rose, a sound less like human speech and more like the sudden intake of breath before a plunge into freezing water. Guilty. The word landed on the oak floorboards with a dull thud, heavy enough to crack the wood, heavy enough to stop the heart of every mother in the room who had ever posted a letter to Caversham. Relief exploded first, a chaotic eruption of sobs and muttered prayers that bounced off the high, grimy windows, followed instantly by the crushing weight of finality that turned the air thick and unbreathable. Women clutched their shawls, knuckles white, while men removed their hats not out of respect, but because the heat of so many bodies packed into the small space made the room swim with a greasy, feverish haze. Bracken sat rigid in his chair, the quill poised above the ledger, his hand a claw of bone and tendon that refused to lower itself despite the verdict having been spoken. He needed to write. The protocol demanded the recording of the sentence, the precise transcription of Baron Pollock's condemnation, the capture of Dyer's response for the archives that would sit in the dark long after the ink had faded. Order, syntax, the sanctity of the record. These were the only things holding the ceiling up, the only barriers between civilization and the raw, screaming chaos of what had just been admitted into the world. Silence in court, the bailiff barked, his voice cracking under the strain of trying to impose quiet on a room full of breaking hearts. The noise subsided into a low, vibrating hum, 1,000 suppressed griefs settling into the dust motes dancing in the shafts of grey light. Baron Pollock adjusted his wig, the horsehair gleaming under the gas jets, and leaned forward to deliver the judgment that would seal Amelia Dyer's fate. His voice was dry, legalistic, devoid of the tremor that shook the gallery, reciting the statute regarding the murder of Doris Marmon with the same flat tone one might use to read a list of stolen goods. Bracken's nib touched the paper. He wrote the prisoner. He wrote found guilty. The letters formed perfectly, round and upright, betraying none of the nausea churning in his gut. He thought of the blue ribbon found in the bag at Reading, the one tied so tightly it had left a groove in the soft flesh of the neck, and he forced his hand to move faster, as if speed could outrun the image. I sentence you to death, Pollock intoned, the words dropping like stones into a well, and may God have mercy on your soul. Amelia Dyer stood, She did not tremble. She did not collapse into the arms of the matron standing nearby, nor did she offer the theatrical weeping the crowd seemed to expect from a woman condemned to hang. Instead, she smoothed the front of her black dress, brushing away an invisible speck of lint with a gesture of domestic fastidiousness that felt more obscene than any scream. Her eyes, small and bright as beetle shells, scanned the courtroom not with fear, but with a mild, calculating curiosity, as if she were assessing the value of the furniture rather than the finality of her own end. "My lord," she said, her voice clear and carrying a strange, cheerful lilt that cut through the stale air. "There is unfinished business regarding the other children. The accounts are not quite settled, you see, and the mothers will be wanting their receipts." The sentence hung there, suspended in the smoke and the silence. Bracken's hand stopped. The nib rested on the page, a dark pool of ink beginning to swell at the tip, threatening to bleed through the thin paper and stain the line below. 10 seconds. He counted them in the hammering of his own pulse, a rhythmic tally that stretched into an eternity while the courtroom held its breath. This was a breach. A scribe did not pause. A scribe did not hesitate. The record flowed uninterrupted from the mouth of the speaker to the page, a seamless river of truth that washed away the mess of human error. But here, in the face of such chilling banality, the mechanism jammed. She spoke of receipts. She spoke of accounts. As if the lives she had extinguished were merely entries in a ledger waiting to be balanced, transactions delayed by a temporary lack of funds. Bracken looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since the trial began, and saw not a monster, but a mirror. She was the logical conclusion of the system he served, the ultimate accountant of the desperate, reducing the agony of separation and death to a matter of pending correspondence. "Take her down," the judge said, his voice tight, eager to close the book on this peculiar horror. The matron stepped forward, gripping Dyer's arm with a familiarity that suggested they had shared many such moments. Dyer went willingly, still talking, her head turned slightly as she addressed the clerk's table directly. "Tell them I am detained on business, Mr. Bracken," she called out, her tone conversational, almost apologetic. "Tell them the letters will be answered as soon as I am able. It is only a matter of time." Bracken dipped his pen, the ink cold against the metal. He wrote the prisoner expressed no remorse, a lie that sat stark and inadequate on the page. She had expressed remorse, after all, paying in the only currency she understood by worrying over the unfinished ledgers of the dead. Pressing harder until the nib scratched a furrow into the paper, he grew desperate to capture the nuance, to make the record reflect the sheer, terrifying normalcy of her evil. But the rules forbade interpretation, demanding only the fact. She had spoken, he had transcribed, the rest was silence. The courtroom began to empty, the crowd spilling out into the corridor like water breaching a dam, eager to escape the presence of the woman who had turned motherhood into a slaughterhouse. Chairs scraped against the floor, a discordant rhythm that grated against Bracken's nerves. He remained seated, staring at the line he had just written, watching the ink dry from a wet gloss to a matte black scar. His thumb rubbed against his forefinger, the skin raw and tender, seeking the friction that usually grounded him but finding only a numbness that spread up his arm. He needed to finish the file. The arrest report, the deposition of the foster mother, the inventory of effects, all of it needed to be collated, stitched together into a single, coherent narrative that the Home Office could file away. But his hands felt heavy, filled with lead, and the thought of touching the papers made his stomach turn. "Mr. Bracken." Inspector Godley stood beside the table, his hat in his hands, looking down at the clerk with an expression of confused concern. The noise of the departing crowd had faded to a distant murmur, leaving the two men alone in the suddenly vast room. "The file, sir," Bracken said, his voice sounding thin, stripped of its usual authority. "It requires the final inventory before transfer to Newgate." "Leave it for the morning," Godley said, reaching out to touch the stack of papers. "You look done in, man, pale as a sheet. Come away with me. A brandy will set you right." "No," Bracken pulled the ledger closer, shielding it with his arm as he insisted the protocol must be observed. "The transfer happens at dawn, and the paperwork must be ready." "It's just paper, Thomas. It is the only thing we have." Godley hesitated, then nodded slowly, stepping back. He understood the rigidity, the way the bureaucracy acted as a splint for a broken spirit, even if he did not share the belief. "Very well, I'll wait outside, don't be long." Bracken watched him go, the heavy boots echoing on the floorboards until the door clicked shut. Alone again, the gas jets hissed, a low, serpentine sound that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. He opened the folder containing the preliminary list of Dyer's possessions. There were clothes, mostly baby things, tiny socks and bonnets that smelled even now of the lavender water she used to mask the scent of decay. There were letters, hundreds of them, bundled with string, the hopeful scrawls of unmarried women seeking a safe harbor for their shame. And there, at the bottom of the list, waiting to be confirmed and signed, was the item that had sat in her lap during the reading of the verdict. He picked up his pen again, the weight of it unfamiliar in his grip, and moved to the final line of the inventory sheet. He had to see it. He had to verify the object that had sustained her through the condemnation of her soul. The ink hovered over the paper, trembling slightly, before descending to commit the final, banal truth to the permanent record. Item 4, Hymnbook, worn. The words sat on the page, small and harmless, a trifling notation in a ledger already swollen with the weight of stolen lives. Bracken stared at them until the letters blurred, the black ink spreading into grey smudges that looked suspiciously like the silt of the riverbed where so many of Dyer's charges now rested. He blinked, forcing the focus back, but the damage was done. The page was ruined, a testament to a hand that could no longer be trusted to record the truth without trembling. He reached for the blotter, pressing it down with a violence that threatened to tear the paper, soaking up the excess until the fiber bloated and tore under the friction. Useless. He pushed the ledger away, the wood of the table groaning in protest as his elbows scraped across the surface. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the gas jets burned lower, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for the stacks of evidence piled high in the corner. The smell of lavender had intensified, cloying and sweet, fighting a losing battle against the underlying stench of old sweat and the metallic tang of the iron railing that separated the dock from the public gallery. It was the scent of a nursery left unaired, of clothes kept too long in a chest, a perfume used to mask the rot of things that should have been buried weeks ago. Bracken stood, his knees cracking with a sound like dry twigs snapping underfoot. He needed air, not the stale, recycled breath of the courtroom, but the raw, cold-choked wind of the street, the smell of horses and wet stone that meant life, however grim, was still moving forward. He gathered the papers, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, stacking the depositions into a neat pile that felt precarious in his shaking hands. The top sheet, the inventory, slipped from his grip and fluttered to the floor, landing face up. Item 4, Hymnbook, worn. He bent to retrieve it, his fingers brushing the coarse grain of the wood floorboards, and for a second he imagined he could hear the rustle of pages turning, the soft, rhythmic breathing of a woman reading verses about golden links and heavenly shores while a child starved in the next room. The hypocrisy of it curdled in his throat, a bitter bile that he swallowed hard, forcing it back down where it joined the guilt and the exhaustion that had taken up permanent residence in his gut. He straightened, clutching the papers to his chest as if they were a shield, and walked towards the door. The corridor outside was empty, the frantic energy of the verdict having dissipated into the London night, leaving behind only the echo of footsteps and the distant clatter of a cab wheel on cobblestones. Bracken walked, his boots making no sound on the worn runner that lined the hall, a ghost moving through a building dedicated to the processing of human misery. He passed the clerk's office, the door ajar, revealing a desk cluttered with half-eaten sandwiches and inkwells left uncapped, the mundane detritus of men who would go home to warm fires and sleeping children while he carried the weight of the gallows in his pocket. Newgate was a short walk, yet it felt like a pilgrimage to the end of the world. The fog had rolled in off the river, thick and yellow, clinging to his coat and dampening his hair until he felt as though he were wading through a visible soup of sulphur and despair. He kept his head down, avoiding the gaze of the few passers-by who hurried along the pavement, their collars turned up against the chill, eager to put the day's news behind them. They knew, everyone knew. The name Amelia Dyer was already on every tongue, a byword for evil that would be whispered over tea tables and in pub corners for generations to come. But they did not know the texture of her voice, the calm, practical tone she used when discussing the disposal of a body, the way she looked at him not as a judge of her soul, but as a scribe of her accounts. The great gates of the prison loomed out of the mist, black and imposing, the stone worn smooth by centuries of rain and regret. Bracken showed his pass to the warder, a man with eyes that had seen too much and learned to see nothing, and stepped inside. The air here was different, heavier, stripped of the river's dampness, and replaced with the dry, dusty smell of lime and old straw. It was the smell of endings. "She is expecting you, Mr. Bracken," the warder said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. "Cell 4, she has been reading." Bracken nodded, unable to speak, and followed the man down the dimly lit corridor. The cells were small, iron-barred boxes that offered no privacy, no comfort, only a narrow bed and a stool. In cell 4, Amelia Dyer sat on the edge of her mattress, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a small book open on her knees. She looked up as they approached, her face serene, almost beatific, illuminated by the flickering light of the corridor lamp. There were no tears, no signs of the fear that must have been gnawing at her insides, eating her alive from the inside out. She looked like a grandmother waiting for a train, patient and prepared. "Mr. Bracken," she said, her voice bright, cheerful even in this tomb. "I was just finishing the chapter. It is a comfort, is it not, to know that the links are golden, that they cannot be broken." Bracken stopped before the bars, the papers in his hand suddenly feeling like lead weights. He looked at the book in her lap, the cover battered and stained, the pages dog-eared from use. Golden links. The very title seemed to mock him, a promise of unity and salvation in a world where mothers were separated from their children by a rope and a drop. "The inventory, Mrs. Dyer," he managed to say, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, hollow and distant. "I require your confirmation." "Of course," she said, closing the book with a gentle snap and placing it on the stool beside her. "One must be tidy to the end. It is only proper." She stood, smoothing her skirts, and walked to the bars, her eyes fixed on his with an intensity that made him want to step back, to flee this place and never return. But he held his ground, the protocol a rigid cage that held him in place. She reached through the bars, her fingers brushing his as she took the pen he offered and signed her name on the bottom of the sheet. The handwriting was steady, the loops of the D and Y elegant and precise, a stark contrast to the chaos she had unleashed upon the world. "There," she said, handing the paper back. "All in order, you see, Mr. Bracken, the book's balance." She smiled then, a genuine, terrifying smile that did not reach her eyes, and picked up her hymn book again. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have a little more reading to do before the morning. One must be ready, mustn't one?" Bracken turned away, the paper crumpling in his grip as he walked back down the corridor, the warder trailing silently behind him. He did not look back. He could not. The image of her sitting there, calm and composed, surrounded by the evidence of her sins, was burned into his mind, a brand that would never fade. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the fog, the cool air hitting his face like a slap, but it offered no relief, no cleansing. The governor was waiting by the gate, a lantern in his hand, the flame dancing wildly in the wind. He held out a clipboard, a final form for signing, the official transfer of custody from the court to the executioner. "Just here, Mr. Bracken," the governor said, pointing to the line at the bottom. "Confirm receipt of effects." Bracken took the pen, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold it. He looked down at the list, the typed words swimming before his eyes until they resolved into clarity. And there it was, the final nail in the coffin of his sanity, reduced to a single, bureaucratic line item. Item 4, hymn book worn. He signed his name, the ink pooling where his hand hesitated, a dark stain that looked too much like blood. The ink bloomed across the fiber, a dark, spreading wound that refused to dry. Bracken stared at it, watching the black seep into the grain of the paper, obscuring the typed letters beneath until the signature looked less like a name and more like a bruise. He held his breath, waiting for the governor to comment on the tremor, to note the way his hand had betrayed the rigid composure required of a court officer, but the man said nothing. The governor merely took the clipboard back, the wood creaking under his grip, and tucked it beneath his arm as if it contained nothing more than a list of broken chairs or misplaced brooms. "Thank you, Mr. Bracken," the governor said, his tone flat, stripped of any recognition of what had just passed between the bars. "We shall proceed at dawn. You need not attend the drop unless you wish to verify the identity of the body." Bracken flinched. The word drop landed in the damp air, heavy and final, stripping the ceremony of its legal veneer and leaving only the mechanics of strangulation. He shook his head, a sharp, jerky motion that sent a spray of fog from his hat brim onto his cheek. The cold water ran down his jawline, mingling with the sweat that had gathered there despite the chill, a slick, uncomfortable film that made his skin feel too tight for his skull. "No," Bracken said, his voice cracked, a dry splinter in the throat. "No verification is necessary. The record is complete." "Pity," the governor muttered, turning his lantern so the light swept across the wet cobbles, illuminating the swirling mist that clung to the ground like wet wool. "Some find it brings closure, seeing the end of the thing." "There is no closure in a ledger," Bracken replied, the words tumbling out before he could check their weight, before he could sand down their edges to make them fit for polite conversation. "There is only the sum." The governor paused, one hand on the iron gate latch, and looked at him. For a second, the mask of bureaucratic indifference slipped, revealing a flicker of something weary and human, a shared exhaustion born of too many mornings spent watching the trapdoor open. He did not argue. He simply nodded, a slow dip of the chin, and pushed the gate open. The hinges screamed, a high metallic shriek that cut through the low hum of the city, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the teeth, in the bone, rattling the very fillings until Bracken had to clamp his jaw shut to stop them from chattering. "Good night, then," the governor said. "Mind the step. It's slick with the tide coming in." Bracken stepped out onto the pavement, the stone slippery under his boot, and pulled his coat tighter around his throat. The fog had thickened while he was inside, rolling off the river in great, suffocating waves that swallowed the gas lamps whole, leaving only faint, sickly halos of yellow light that offered no guidance, no warmth. He began to walk, his boots clicking a staccato rhythm against the wet stones, a lonely, hollow sound that echoed off the high prison walls and followed him down the narrow street. He walked fast, too fast, as if he could outrun the image of Dyer's hands folded neatly in her lap, as if he could leave the smell of lime and old straw behind him if he just moved quickly enough to outrun his own lungs. The river was invisible, hidden behind the warehouses and the wharves, but he could feel it. He could feel the great, sluggish pull of the tide dragging at the foundations of the city, a silent, greedy mouth waiting to swallow whatever was thrown into it. He thought of Doris Marmon, of the small knitted boots listed in the evidence, of the blue ribbon that had been tied so carefully around a neck that would never grow thick enough to wear a collar. He thought of the mothers who had written to Dyer, women who had poured their desperation onto paper, begging for a solution to a problem that society refused to acknowledge, women who had trusted a monster because the alternative was shame. And he thought of Sarah. The thought arrived unbidden, sharp and sudden, a hook dragging through the soft tissue of his mind. He stopped walking, leaning against the damp brick of a warehouse wall to steady himself, his chest heaving as he sucked in the foul, sulphurous air. Sarah in her bed in reading, wrapped in shawls that smelled of lavender and sickness, waiting for a letter that would tell her everything was well, that her brother was safe, that the world still made sense. He had promised to write. He had promised to send money. But what could he tell her? How could he explain that the world was a place where a woman could strangle dozens of infants with knitting wool, and then sit in her cell reading hymns about golden links, serene and unrepentant, while the machinery of the state prepared to break her neck with the same efficient indifference? He reached into his pocket and pulled out his notebook, the leather cover soft and greasy from use. He flipped it open, the pages rustling in the quiet street, and found a blank space near the back. He uncapped his fountain pen, the nib gleaming in the dim light, and pressed it to the paper. The ink flowed instantly, dark and fluid, forming the letters of her name, "My dearest Sarah." He stopped. The pen hovered above the page, a drop of ink gathering at the tip, trembling, ready to fall and ruin the whiteness of the paper. What came next? "I am well, a lie, justice has been served. a hollow phrase that tasted like ash. "I am afraid," the truth, but a truth he could not speak, could not commit to paper lest it become real, lest it infect her too with the horror that now lived in his own marrow. He looked down at the words, at the elegant loop of the S, and felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea rise in his throat. He capped the pen with a sharp click, the sound echoing like a pistol shot in the empty street, and slammed the notebook shut. He shoved it back into his pocket, deep, burying it beneath his handkerchief and his gloves, as if he could hide the failure of his own voice from himself. A cart rumbled past, the wheels splashing through a puddle, sending a spray of muddy water up against his trousers. He did not flinch. He just watched the cart disappear into the fog, the driver's silhouette fading until it was gone, swallowed by the grey. He pushed himself off the wall and continued walking, his steps slower now, heavier, dragging against the pavement, as if the soles of his boots had turned to lead. The gas lamp outside his lodgings flickered as he approached, the flame sputtering in the draught, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and twisted across the doorstep. He fumbled for his key, his fingers numb and clumsy, and turned the lock. The door opened with a groan, revealing the dim hallway of his building, the air inside stale and still, smelling of boiled cabbage and damp dust. He stepped inside and closed the door, shutting out the fog, the river, the prison, but knowing that none of it mattered, that the walls of this room were as thin as paper, that the silence inside was just as loud as the screaming he had transcribed all week. He climbed the stairs to his room, each step creaking under his weight, and lit the gas jet on his desk. The flame hissed into life, casting a harsh white light over the clutter of papers, the inkwells, the stacks of depositions that waited for his review. He sat down, the chair groaning in protest, and stared at the blank page of his ledger. He picked up his pen again, the weight of it familiar, comforting even, a tool he knew how to use, a weapon he could wield with precision. He dipped the nib into the ink. He touched it to the paper, and he began to write, not the letter to Sarah, not the confession of his fear, but the final line of the Dyer file, the official record that would stand long after he was dead, long after the river had washed away the bones. Case closed, execution pending. The words looked small on the page, insignificant against the vast, dark emptiness of the room. He blew on the ink to dry it, watching the sheen fade until the letters were matte and final, and then he leaned back, closing his eyes, listening to the silence that pressed against the windows, a silence that was not empty at all, but filled with the whispers of the dead, the crying of the mothers, the cheerful, terrible voice of a woman who knew that the books balanced. Damp wool and the sour tang of unwashed bodies pressed against Bracken's face before he saw the crowd. He stood near the iron railings of Newgate, the cold bite of the metal seeping through his glove as he gripped it, knuckles whitening until the skin threatened to split. Around him, the city held its breath, not in reverence, but in a hungry, static anticipation that felt less like justice and more like a gathering for a public dissection. Men in flat caps shoved forward, elbows digging into ribs, while women clutched shawls tight against their throats, their eyes fixed on the black drape hanging above the entrance, a void waiting to be filled. Bracken did not look up. He kept his gaze locked on the mud churning beneath 100 boots, a slurry of horse dung and river silt that sucked at his heels with every shift of weight. The smell here was different from the court. It lacked the sterile sting of carbolic soap and carried instead the heavy, organic reek of fear sweating out of pores, mixing with the coal smoke that clung to the brickwork like a second skin. A man beside him, face red and bloated from drink, let out a low whistle, a sharp, bird-like sound that cut through the murmur. "Be done soon," the man said, voice thick with London gravel. "Sun's barely up and they're already at it." Bracken said nothing. He adjusted his hat, pressing the brim down until it dug into his temples, a physical anchor against the vertigo threatening to tilt the pavement. The pressure inside his skull matched the rising tide he knew was rolling miles away, a slow, inevitable swell that would soon lap against the pilings where Doris Marmon had floated, bloated and blue before the police hauled her out. The clock inside the prison began to chime. 8 strokes, slow, deliberate, each one vibrating through the soles of Bracken's boots, counting down seconds that belonged to no one anymore. The crowd surged, a single organism contracting, and a woman near the front let out a sob that was quickly stifled by a hand over her mouth. "Quiet now," someone hissed. "Let the law do its work." Law, the word hung in the air, brittle and hollow. Bracken thought of the depositions stacked on his desk, the neat rows of ink that detailed how Amelia Dyer had negotiated the price of a child's life with the same casual precision a housewife used to haggle over cuts of meat. He remembered her voice, cheerful and mundane, discussing insurance policies while a baby starved in the next room, and he felt a sudden, violent urge to retch, to double over and empty his stomach onto the boots of the man beside him. Instead, he straightened his spine, the movement stiff and mechanical, and watched a patch of mud bubble as a boot lifted. When the trap fell, there was no sound from the scaffold, only a collective exhale from the throng, a rush of air that sounded like wind moving through dry reeds. The crowd did not cheer. They did not scream. They simply stood, watching the black drape settle, their faces blank masks of satisfaction that chilled Bracken more than the fog ever could. It was over. The state had strangled the murderer, and the balance sheet of the empire remained balanced, the columns tallied and signed. But as the people began to disperse, drifting away like smoke in a breeze, Bracken saw them. Not ghosts, there were no spirits here, only the relentless grinding machinery of memory. He saw the small shapes rising from the mud at his feet, imaginary infants wrapped in dirty shawls, their faces turned upward in silent accusation. Doris Marmon, the twins from Epsom, the boy found in the bag at Reading. They were not avenged. They were merely processed, their deaths converted into statistics that would soon be filed away in a basement archive, gathering dust alongside thefts and vagrancy charges. "Done then," the drunk man muttered, turning to Bracken with a grin that showed missing teeth. "Right proper ending, ain't it?" Bracken flinched as if struck. He stepped back, his heels slipping in the sludge, and nearly collided with a woman carrying a basket of vegetables. "Watch it," she snapped, jerking her load away from his coat. Clumsy oaf. "Forgive me," Bracken whispered, his voice cracking, the words barely audible over the clatter of the departing carts. I did not see." He turned away from them all, pulling his collar up against the damp air, and began the long walk back to the Thames police court. His legs moved automatically, one foot in front of the other, navigating the waking streets where shopkeepers were already sweeping their steps and delivery boys were shouting over the rumble of wheels. The normalcy of it was obscene. A baker pulled trays of bread from an oven, the scent of yeast drifting out to mix with the smell of the river, and a group of schoolchildren marched past in lockstep, singing a hymn that sounded painfully similar to the ones Dyer had read in her cell. "Golden links, forever bind." The melody stuck in his head, a burr caught in the lining of his mind, repeating over and over as he pushed open the heavy doors of the court. Inside, the air was still and cool, smelling of old paper and floor wax. The silence here was different from the street. It was expectant, waiting for the next tragedy to be logged and transcribed. He walked down the corridor towards the clerk's room, his footsteps echoing on the flagstones, and stopped short at the doorway. Two junior clerks were already at work. One stood on a ladder, dipping a broad brush into a bucket of whitewash, spreading thick white strokes over the wall where the Dyer case files had been pinned for weeks. The other sat at a desk, shuffling papers into a box with efficient, rhythmic movements, the sound of cardboard sliding against cardboard filling the room. "Morning, Mr. Bracken," the seated clerk said, not looking up. "Just clearing the board for the next lot. Magistrate wants the room fresh by noon." Bracken stared at the wall. The white paint was wet, glistening under the gas jets, covering the notes, the timelines, the photographs of the victims that had haunted his sleep for a month. In minutes, it would be dry, and the room would look as if nothing had ever happened, as if no children had died and no woman had been hanged. The erasure was total, terrifying in its speed. "The files?" Bracken asked, his voice tight. "Boxed and sealed," the clerk replied, tapping the lid shut with a dull thud. "Going down to storage. Case closed, sir." Case closed. The words echoed the line he had written in his ledger hours ago, but hearing them spoken aloud, in such a casual tone, made his chest constrict. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his handkerchief, the linen crisp and white, and began to clean his spectacles. He rubbed the lenses hard, faster and faster, folding the cloth into smaller squares until it was a tight ball in his palm, but the blur in his vision did not clear. "Sir," the clerk on the ladder paused, brushed dripping white spots onto the dropped cloth. "You all right? You look a bit peaky." Bracken did not answer. He pushed past them, stumbling slightly as he entered the main courtroom. It was empty now. The benches where the grieving mothers had sat, weeping into their gloves, were bare. The witness stand stood empty, the wood polished and indifferent. He walked to his desk and sank into the chair, the wood creaking under his weight, and placed his hands flat on the surface. The silence rushed in, deafening after the noise of the crowd and the chatter of the clerks. It pressed against his eardrums, heavy and suffocating. He looked at the empty space on the desk where the Dyer file had sat, and then he lowered his head into his hands. His shoulders shook once, twice, and then he was weeping, great heaving sobs that tore from his throat, unbidden and uncontrollable. He cried for Doris Marmon, whose name was now just ink on a page. He cried for the mothers who had trusted the wrong woman. He cried for himself, trapped in this machine that turned human agony into administrative procedure, grinding it down until it was smooth enough to file away. He cried until his throat was raw and his eyes burned, and when he finally lifted his head, wiping his face with a trembling hand, the room was still empty, still silent, still waiting for the next case to begin. He took a deep, shuddering breath and reached for his bag, intending to pack his things and leave, to escape this tomb of bureaucracy before he suffocated. But as he swung the bag onto the table, something caught his eye. Sitting on the evidence table in the corner, forgotten in the rush to whitewash the walls, was the small, leather-bound hymn book, Golden Links. It had been taken from Dyer's cell that morning, listed as Exhibit 44, and somehow, in the chaos of the execution, it had been left behind. Bracken stood up, his legs unsteady, and walked over to it. He picked up the book, the leather warm from the room's air, and opened it. The pages fell open naturally to a hymn about rest and peace, the words printed in stark black type, but it was not the text that stopped his breath. Pressed between the pages, marking the verse, "There we shall meet and no more part," was a small dried flower, a forget-me-not. Its blue petals were faded, crushed flat by the weight of the book, but the color remained, a tiny splash of vibrant life in the midst of all this death. Bracken traced the stem with his thumb, feeling the delicate fragility of it, and wondered how a woman who could strangle a child with knitting wool could also press a flower with such care. The contradiction sat in his hand, light as air and heavy as lead, refusing to be filed, refusing to be whitewashed, demanding to be seen. The flower crumbled. Just a dusting of blue powder on his thumb, the structural integrity of the petal destroyed by the pressure of his own skin, and Bracken stared at the stain as if it were blood. He had expected the texture of dried leaf, something brittle that might snap, but this disintegration felt like a final, quiet surrender, the last act of a life that had been systematically erased from the walls and the ledgers and the memory of the court. "How does one keep it?" he whispered to the empty room, the words catching in his raw throat. "How does one keep a thing that wants to turn to dust?" No answer came, only the faint drip of the whitewash bucket from the adjoining clerk's room, a rhythmic plip-plip-plip that sounded like a clock counting down seconds that no longer mattered. He closed the book, the leather cover cool and slightly greasy under his palm, and the sound of the latch clicking shut echoed with a finality that made him flinch. It was a small sound, insignificant against the roar of the city outside, yet it carried the weight of the gallows drop, the same sudden cessation of motion that had ended Amelia Dyer's mourning just an hour prior. He turned the book over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, surprisingly light for an object that had witnessed so much calculation. Inside those pages, Dyer had found comfort, or perhaps just a routine, tracing the lines of hymns while she waited for the next mother to arrive with the next bundle, the next fee, the next life to be negotiated and extinguished. The banality of it curdled in his stomach, a sour taste that had nothing to do with the coal smoke or the damp wool of his coat. She had sung of golden links and eternal rest, while her fingers tightened around the necks of infants, the same fingers that had carefully pressed this fragile bloom between the verses of a prayer. "Madness," he said aloud, testing the word, finding it too small, too clean. It isn't madness, it's arithmetic. He walked back to his desk, the hymn book clutched against his chest like a shield, and sat down heavily. The chair groaned, a familiar complaint that usually anchored him, but today the furniture seemed to lean away, as if the room itself was recoiling from the scent of grief that clung to him. He placed the book on the blotter, next to the stack of fresh ledgers waiting for the next case, the next tragedy, the next name to be reduced to a column of dates and outcomes. The contrast was obscene. The vibrant, crushed blue of the flower against the stark, ruled lines of the court record, life and death bound together in a single, impossible volume. Bracken reached for his pen, the nib cold and stiff from disuse, and dipped it into the inkwell. The black liquid swallowed the tip, glossy and deep, and he hovered it over the page, intending to write the final notation for the day, the official confirmation that Exhibit 44 had been secured. But his hand refused to move. The ink gathered at the point, swelling into a trembling droplet that threatened to fall and ruin the pristine paper, a dark star forming in the center of his vision. He thought of the mothers, not the ones who had sat in the gallery, weeping into their handkerchiefs, but the ones who had never made it to court, the ones whose letters to Dyer were now evidence of their own desperation, their own complicity in the trade. He thought of the young woman from last winter, the one he had turned away with a citation of regulations and a suggestion to seek private adoption, her face pale and pinched with a hunger that went beyond food. Had she held a flower once? Had she believed in golden links, or had the river taken her hope long before it took her child? The record must be kept, he murmured, the mantra of his 20 years of service, but the words tasted like ash. The record must be perfect. Perfect, a perfect record of imperfect lives, a flawless transcription of screams muffled by swaddling clothes. He looked at the hymn book again, the leather binding scarred and worn, and realized that the flower was not a symbol of peace, but a marker of absence. It marked the place where the singing stopped, where the prayer ended and the knitting wool began, and in that space, in that terrible silence between the verse and the act, lay the true horror of Amelia Dyer. Not the killing, which was swift and brutal, but the living, the day-to-day existence of a woman who could hold both a flower and a noose in the same hand without feeling the weight of either. A draft swept through the courtroom, rattling the window pane, and the gas jets flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched across the floor like reaching fingers. Bracken shivered, pulling his coat tighter, and finally moved his hand. He did not write the inventory number. Instead, he drew a single, shaky line beneath the date, a jagged scar of ink that tore slightly into the fiber of the paper, a physical breach in the sanctity of the ledger. It was a small rebellion, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look, but it was there, a testament to the fact that something had happened here that could not be filed, could not be whitewashed, could not be closed. "Mr. Bracken." The voice came from the doorway, sharp and intrusive, shattering the fragile solitude he had constructed. Bracken jerked his hand back, knocking the inkwell slightly so that a drop of black splashed onto the blotter, spreading rapidly towards the hymn book. He scrambled to catch it with his handkerchief, smearing the ink across the leather cover, staining the place where the flower lay hidden. The junior clerk stood in the doorway, holding a stack of fresh forms, his face unreadable in the dim light. "The magistrate is asking for the final deposition summary. He wants it on his desk before he leaves for the day," said "It's urgent." Bracken stared at the smear of ink on the hymn book, a dark wound on the cover that looked disturbingly like a bruise. He covered it with his hand, hiding the damage, hiding the evidence of his lapse. "Urgent," Bracken repeated, his voice flat, devoid of the tremor that had shaken him moments before. "Yes, of course, everything is urgent until it is filed." He pushed the hymn book aside, burying it under a pile of blank forms, out of sight, out of mind. The flower was gone now, crushed further by the weight of the paper, just another secret buried in the archives of the Thames police court. He picked up his pen again, the nib clean and sharp, and dipped it into the ink. "Tell the magistrate I shall have it within the hour," Bracken said, his handwriting already settling into its familiar, flawless script, the jagged line forgotten, the grief compartmentalized, the machine restarting its relentless, grinding work. "Tell him the case is closed." But as the clerk turned to leave, Bracken caught the scent of the river on his own coat, a damp, muddy smell that seemed to rise from the floorboards, from the walls, from the very ink in the well, and he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like a cold stone, that nothing was ever truly closed, not while the tide continued to turn. The junior clerk's footsteps faded down the corridor, a rhythmic tapping of boot heels on flagstone that sounded too much like a countdown. Bracken waited until the echo died completely, until the dust motes dancing in the gaslight settled back into the gloom, before he allowed his shoulders to drop an inch. The ink stain on the hymn book had dried to a dull, matte scab, a permanent blemish on the leather that no amount of polishing would ever remove. He stared at it. The black smear looked like a bruise blooming on old skin, a violent interruption in the orderly narrative of the court's inventory. "Closed," he whispered to the empty room. The word hung there, thin and brittle, snapping under the weight of its own falsehood. Nothing about this was closed. The file might be tied with red tape and stamped with the magistrate's seal, but the smell of the river clung to the back of his throat, thick and cloying, tasting of silt and things left to rot in the dark. He reached for the handkerchief in his pocket, the linen already damp from his earlier panic, and began to wipe his spectacles. The cloth was clean, immaculate. Yet he rubbed the lenses with a frantic, circular motion, pressing hard enough to blur his vision, as if the grime he sought to remove was not on the glass, but behind his eyes, etched into the retina by weeks of transcribing the mundane details of infant death. Outside, the city carried on. A cart rumbled past the high windows, the iron rims grinding against the cobbles, a sound so ordinary it felt like an insult. Somewhere a woman laughed, sharp and bright, a noise that had no place in a building dedicated to the processing of tragedy. Bracken capped his pen, the click of the mechanism sounding like a pistol shot in the stillness, and stood up. His knees cracked, a dry, brittle sound that matched the state of his nerves. He needed to leave. The air in here had grown stale, recycled too many times through lungs that had spoken only of fees, swaddling clothes, and shallow grave. He moved to the evidence table, the wooden surface scarred by decades of ink spills and knife marks, and began to gather his things. The stack of depositions regarding Doris Marmon sat to his left, a neat pile of paper that contained the entire sum of a short, suffocated life. He touched the top sheet. The paper felt cold, clammy, as though it had been pulled from the water alongside the body it described. He slid the documents into his leather satchel, the action mechanical, practiced, devoid of the trembling that had seized him only minutes before. Procedure was a shield. If he followed the steps, if he adhered to the rigid architecture of the law, he could keep the horror at bay. But the shield was leaking. He picked up the hymn book again, unable to leave it buried under the blank forms where he had shoved it. The leather was sticky where the ink had spread, tarnishing the gold lettering of the title. Golden Links. The words seemed to mock him now, a promise of connection in a world that severed ties for a few shillings. He opened the book to the marked page, the pressed blue flower brittle and fading against the cream-colored paper. The verse beneath it spoke of rest, of a gathering of saints, of a home beyond the river. Amelia Dyer had read this. She had touched these pages, perhaps hummed the tune while she tightened the knitting wool around a small, struggling neck. The cognitive dissonance made Bracken's stomach turn, a physical roll of nausea that forced him to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. How did a person hold both the sacred and the profane in the same hand without the flesh burning away? He traced the stem of the pressed flower with an ink-stained finger. It crumbled slightly under the pressure, releasing a faint, dusty scent of dried lavender that clashed violently with the smell of the court. This was the banality of it. Not a monster with horns or a demon's grin, but a woman who prayed before she killed, who saved flowers in her Bible while she calculated the profit margin on a baby's insurance policy. The horror wasn't in the deviation from norms, it was in the perfect alignment of them. Dyer had followed the rules of her own twisted economy with the same meticulous care Bracken applied to his ledgers. Practical, he muttered, the word tasting sour. She was just being practical. Justification rang hollow, a pathetic attempt to make sense of the senseless. He closed the book with a snap, the sound final and heavy, and tucked it under his arm. He would return it to the storeroom. Let the evidence clerk deal with the stain. Let someone else explain why a killer kept a pressed flower in her prayer book. His duty was done. The transcription was complete. The record was perfect, save for that one jagged line he had drawn, a secret rebellion hidden in the margins of history. He turned towards the door, his coat tails swishing against his calves, and took 2 steps before stopping. The silence of the courtroom had changed. It was no longer the quiet of an empty room. It was a listening silence, heavy and expectant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Bracken slowly turned his head. The gas jets flickered again, the flames dipping low before surging back up, casting the shadow of the evidence table long across the floor. In the distortion of the light, the pile of blank forms he had used to cover the hymn book seemed to shift, rising and falling like a chest breathing. He blinked hard, forcing his eyes to focus on what was just paper, just ink, merely the trick of a tired mind struggling to reconcile the irreconcilable. "You are losing your grip, Thomas," he said aloud, his voice cracking on the second syllable. He walked to the door, his pace quickening, desperate to put distance between himself and the ghost of the woman who had sat in the dock with such terrifying calm. He reached for the handle, the brass cold and smooth under his palm, and pulled. The door swung open with a groan of hinges that sounded suspiciously like a sigh. The corridor beyond was dim, the gas lamps turned low for the evening, stretching the shadows into long, grasping fingers that reached out from the alcoves. Bracken stepped out, pulling the door shut behind him with a firm click. He leaned against the wood for a moment, closing his eyes, trying to summon the image of his sister Sarah's face, the memory of her letters from reading, anything solid and real to anchor him. But all he could see was the blue flower, crushed and stained, and the dark, churning water of the Thames rising to meet it. He pushed off the door and began to walk, his boots echoing loudly in the empty hall, a solitary rhythm marching towards an exit that felt further away with every step. He had to get home. He had to wash the ink from his hands, scrub until the skin was raw, until the smell of the river was gone. But as he passed the clerk's office, he saw the junior clerk sitting at his desk, already starting a new file, the quill scratching rhythmically against fresh paper. The boy didn't look up. He didn't know about the flower. He didn't know about the jagged line in the ledger. He just wrote, filling the page with neat, legible rows, building the next monument to a tragedy that hadn't happened yet. Bracken stopped, his hand hovering over the strap of his satchel. The boy looked up then, meeting his gaze with innocent, untroubled eyes. "Everything all right, sir?" the clerk asked, dipping his pen. "You look pale." Bracken opened his mouth to speak, to warn him, to tell him that the ink never really dries, that the paper remembers everything, but the words stuck in his throat, choked by the dust of 1,000 dead cases. He swallowed, the taste of ash returning, thick and suffocating. "Fine," Bracken managed, the word scraping his throat. "Just fine, carry on." He turned away before the boy could see the tremor in his hands, walking faster now, almost running, fleeing the sound of the scratching quill that followed him down the hall, a relentless, rhythmic ticking that counted down to something he couldn't name, something that waited for him in the dark, damp streets beyond the court's heavy doors. The key scraped the lock, a dry, grating sound that seemed to tear through the quiet of the Wapping landing. Bracken pushed the door open with his shoulder, the wood groaning on hinges stiff with river damp. He did not bother with the gas jet in the hallway. The gloom suited him. It matched the color of the sky outside, a bruised purple settling over the rooftops where the smoke hung low and thick, refusing to disperse. Inside his room, the air was stale, trapped between the walls like a held breath. It smelled of cold tea and the coal dust that found its way into everything, no matter how tightly the windows were shut. Bracken dropped his satchel onto the table. The leather thudded against the wood, heavy with the weight of the day's work, the weight of names transcribed and lives reduced to syntax. He stood there for a moment, his coat still on, the wool damp against his neck, smelling of the Thames, of mud and decay, and the iron tang of blood that no amount of washing could quite remove from the fabric. He reached into his inner pocket. His fingers, usually so steady when guiding a nib across a deposition, trembled slightly as they brushed the folded paper. He pulled it out. The edges were soft from handling, the creases worn white where he had opened and closed it a dozen times since leaving the court. An unsent letter, a confession written in the dead of night, addressed to a sister who lay dying in reading, far from the grime of London and the horrors he curated. Bracken walked to the fireplace. The grate held only ash and the cold, black skeleton of yesterday's fire. He knelt, the knees of his trousers pressing into the rough floorboards, and struck a match. The flare of sulphur bloomed bright and sudden, casting sharp shadows against the peeling wallpaper. He held the flame to the corner of the paper. The fire caught quickly, eating the edge with a hungry, orange mouth. Bracken watched the ink dissolve. I could have helped her. The words curled and blackened, turning into fragile flakes of ash before they could be read. I told her to seek private adoption. I directed her to the market. The flame crept higher, consuming the offer of money, the apology for his silence, the admission that he was just as complicit as the woman who now hung in the yard at Newgate. The paper warped, the heat radiating against his face, dry and intense. He did not pull his hand away. He let the fire take it all, watching until the last fragment of his guilt turned to grey dust and floated up the chimney, joining the soot that coated the flue. Some debts could not be paid. Some truths were too heavy to speak, even to the one person who might understand. To send the letter would be to burden Sarah with a poison she did not need in her final days. Better the silence. Better the clean, unblemished record of a caring brother than the messy reality of a man who had helped build the machine that crushed them all. He stood up, brushing the ash from his knees. His hands were clean now, or as clean as they ever got. The ink stains under his nails remained, permanent tattoos of his trade. He needed air. The room felt too small, the walls closing in as if they knew what he had just burned. Bracken stepped back out into the street. The fog had thickened, clinging to the pavement in wet, greasy ribbons. He walked without direction, his boots splashing through puddles that reflected the distorted glow of the gas lamps. The city was quiet, save for the distant rumble of a hansom cab and the lap of water against the embankment walls. He turned towards the river. It was always there, the great dark artery pumping through the heart of London, carrying away the secrets the city tried to forget. Reached the railing and leaned over, gripping the cold iron. Below, the Thames flowed black and oily, the tide coming in with a slow, relentless surge. Debris bobbed on the surfacia, chunks of wood, a discarded crate, the usual flotsam of a working port. Then a tangle of reeds drifted into the circle of light cast by a nearby lamp. They were bound together with a strip of rag, swirling in the eddy near pilings. For a heartbeat, just a single, terrible heartbeat, the bundle looked like a child. Swaddled, tightly wrapped, floating face down. Bracken gripped the railing tighter, his knuckles white. He knew it was just weeds. He knew the physics of buoyancy and the random patterns of the current, but the shape held him, freezing the blood in his veins. It was Doris Marmon. It was the girl from last winter. It was every infant whose name he had written in the ledger, whose death he had formalized with a neat signature. The river did not care about their names. It did not care about the depositions or the verdicts or the hangman's drop. It simply took them, rolled them in the mud, and carried them out to sea. The bundle of reeds caught on a protruding bolt and spun, unraveling slightly as the water pulled at the rag. The illusion broke. It was just plant matter and rotting twine. Bracken exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that fogged in the cold air. The desperation that had fed Amelia Dyer had not died with her. It was still here, flowing beneath the city, waiting for the next mother who could not keep her child, the next woman who saw no other way out. The current was endless. The hunger was endless. He pushed himself away from the railing. The cold had seeped into his bones, settling deep in his joints. He turned back towards his lodgings. There was nothing to be done here. Standing on the embankment would not bring the dead back. It would not cleanse the ink from his skin. Back in the room, the smell of burnt paper lingered, faint and acrid. Bracken sat at his desk. He lit the gas lamp, the mantle hissing into a bright, steady glow. He took a fresh sheet of paper from the stack, smoothing it down with palms that were finally still. He did not reach for the confession he had burned. He did not reach for the ledger of the dead. He picked up his pen. The nib was clean, sharp, ready. He dipped it into the inkwell, the black liquid swallowing the steel tip. He began to write, not of guilt, not of horror, but of a flower. A simple pressed violet he had once seen on a windowsill in reading, pushing through the frost. He described its color, the delicate vein of purple in the petal, the way it survived the cold. He wrote to Sarah of spring, of the promise of renewal, of things that grew despite the darkness. He lied with every word, and the lie was a kindness. It was the only gift he had left to give. When the letter was sealed and addressed, he placed it by the door for the morning post. Then he sat back, watching the flame of the lamp flicker. The city slept, or pretended to. The river flowed on. And tomorrow the court would open. The doors would swing wide. The mothers would come with their tears and their stories and their desperate hope for justice. And he would be there, ready, the pen in his hand, the ink in his veins, the record waiting to be kept. He blew out the lamp. Darkness rushed in, total and absolute. But in his mind, the scratch of the nib continued, a steady, rhythmic sound against the silence, marking time, marking lives, marking the endless, indifferent flow of the world. The gas mantle hissed, a sharp intake of breath that filled the room with a white, trembling light. Bracken sat. The chair creaked under his weight, a familiar protest of wood against bone. He smoothed the fresh sheet of paper before him, flattening a wrinkle near the top left corner with the palm of his hand, pressing down until the fibers yielded and the surface lay perfect, unblemished, waiting. No confessions sat in the pile of ash in the grate. No accounting of the girl from last winter, the one he had turned away with a polite suggestion and a closed door, remained to stain this new page. That debt was paid in smoke now, rising up the flue to mix with the soot of 1,000 other unspoken regrets. He dipped the nib, the ink welled, black and viscous, clinging to the steel like oil. "My dearest Sarah," he wrote. The words formed slowly, each letter constructed with the careful precision of a mason laying stone, devoid of the tremor that had shaken his hands on the embankment. He did not speak of the trial. He did not mention the name Dyer, nor the heavy thud of the drop that had echoed through the city earlier that day, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards even now. To write of it would be to invite the darkness into her room in reading, to let the smell of the river seep into her linens. She needed air, she needed light. She needed to believe that the world outside her window was still capable of producing something that did not rot. "I found a flower today," he continued, the pen scratching a dry rhythm against the grain. "A violet crushed flat between the pages of an old ledger, yet holding its color with a stubborn defiance that put me in mind of your garden before the frost took it." It was a lie. There had been no violet, no ledger with a pressed bloom tucked inside like a forgotten prayer. He had seen only the black water, the rag-bound reeds, the faceless drift of things discarded. But the truth was a heavy coat, sodden and freezing, and he would not drape it over her shoulders. She was dying. He knew the rattle in her chest from her last letter, the way her sentences grew shorter as her breath grew thinner. She did not need the reality of the Thames police court. She did not need to know that her brother spent his days transcribing the commercial transactions of infant death, reducing screams to syntax and agony to adverbial clauses. He paused, lifting the pen to inspect the nib for any catch, any flaw that might tear the paper. The ink glistened, wet and deep. "It reminded me that life persists," he wrote, the life flowing easier now, smoothing itself out into a believable shape. "Even in the coldest corners, there is a pulse. I shall bring it to you when I visit next, though I fear the journey may fade its petals. Perhaps it is better to remember it as it was, vibrant and whole, rather than risk its decay in transit." He stopped. The sentence hung there, innocent enough on the surface, but carrying the weight of everything he could not say. Better to remember it as it was. Better to keep the memory of the children clean, unspoiled by the knowledge of how they ended, floating face down in the mud near Wapping. Better to let Sarah think of violets than of swaddling clothes used as tourniquets. He blotted the page, the grey powder drinking the excess ink, leaving the words matte and final. There would be no additions. No postscripts detailing the weather or the price of coal. Just the flower, just the lie. Bracken folded the paper. The crease was sharp, precise, a perfect bisecting line. He slid it into the envelope, sealed the flap with a dab of gum that tasted of stale starch, and addressed the front in his neat, clerkly hand. "Miss Sarah Bracken, The Elms, reading." The ink dried quickly in the heat of the lamp. He placed the letter by the door, atop his hat, ready for the morning post. It would leave with the first collection. By noon, it would be on its way, carrying its small, fabricated kindness down the line to a room where the air smelled of lavender and sickness. He sat back. The lamp flickered, the flame dancing within the glass chimney as a draught found its way through the window frame. Shadows stretched long across the floor, distorting the legs of the table, the curve of the chair, making them look like the bars of a cage, or perhaps like the ribs of something vast and skeletal, picked clean by the tide. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, pressing until stars burst behind his eyelids, red and gold against the black. The exhaustion was not a feeling. It was a physical weight, a layer of lead wrapped around his spine, pulling him down into the seat. Tomorrow, the court would open at 9. The clerks would arrive, shaking off the damp, complaining of the cold, arranging their quills and inkwells with the mundane ritual of men who had never seen a body pulled from the river. Baron Pollock would take the bench, his face a mask of judicial gravity, ready to process the next file, the next tragedy, the next nameless sorrow, and Bracken would be there. He would sit at his desk. He would dip his pen. He would listen to the mothers, the fathers, the neighbors, the police constables, and he would write it all down. He would capture their grief in flawless syntax. He would ensure that every sob was punctuated correctly, that every accusation was grammatically sound. It was his function, his purpose, to bear witness by recording, to sanitize the horror until it could be filed, indexed, and stored away in the archives, safe from the chaotic mess of human emotion. He could not save them. He could not stop the river. He could not bring back the girl from last winter or Doris Marmon or the hundreds whose names he would never know. But he could keep the record. He could ensure that the truth, however terrible, was not lost to the fog. Bracken stood. His joints popped, a dry cracking sound in the quiet room. He walked to the window and looked out. The street below was empty, the gas lamps casting pools of yellow light on the wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a lonely, yipping sound that was quickly swallowed by the city's hum. The river was invisible from here, hidden behind the rows of warehouses and tenements, but he could feel it. He could feel its pull, the slow, dark suction of the tide turning, dragging the debris of London out towards the sea. He turned away from the window. The room was cold now, the heat from the lamp insufficient to fight the chill that rose from the floorboards. He did not bother to light the fire again. The ashes in the grate were enough. They held the warmth of what had been burned, the ghost of the confession that would never be sent. He blew out the lamp. The darkness rushed in, instant and total, pressing against his eyes. He did not move. He stood in the blackness, listening to the silence of the room, the settling of the building, the distant, rhythmic lap of water against the pilings that he imagined he could hear if he listened hard enough. The scratch of the nib remained in his mind, a phantom sound, steady and relentless. Scratch, pause, scratch. It was the sound of the world turning, of life continuing despite the weight of the dead. He would sleep now, just a few hours, enough to close his eyes before the alarm clock rang, before the day began again, before the doors swung wide and the mothers came crying into the hall. He would be ready. He had to be. The ink was waiting, the paper was waiting, and the river, indifferent and eternal, flowed on. The Thames Swaddling is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Golden links in the chain that connects mother, home and heaven, Internet Archive. Amelia Dyer. Baby farming. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.